Before we begin tonight's story, let me ask you something. Have you ever driven past one of those quiet, pine-shrouded buildings with a painted sign out front that reads something like Serenity Pines, a peaceful place for our elders? You might nod and think, well, that looks nice, then drive on. But what if I told you that sometimes the most peaceful-looking places can hide the darkest secrets? What if the silence isn't serenity, but fear? Tonight, Grandma's Stories brings you a tale not just of survival, but of reckoning. If you believe the truth deserves a voice, if you think the past should never be buried in quiet halls and polite whispers, then subscribe to our channel and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Now, close your eyes and listen closely. This is Martha's story. The rain had started just before dusk, a slow drizzle that darkened the pine trunks and made the gravel path gleam like a slithering snake. Martha Clayborne sat stiffly in the back seat of her daughter's minivan, clutching her handbag with both hands, as if it might fly away. Her daughter Denise didn't say much after they passed the second gas station. There was only the GPS voice, cheerfully directing them through winding roads that grew narrower and darker. Martha didn't ask questions. She knew better now. She was 67, with thinning hair she still tried to curl, and knuckles that had learned silence from years of marriage and motherhood. Her husband had died 3 years ago, and not long after, Denise began to look at her with the kind of pity reserved for stray dogs and unwanted mail. And then came the incident with the stove, or so Denise said. Martha remembered turning it off. She was sure, but the firemen had come anyway. "We're here," Denise said, putting the car in park outside a large white structure half hidden by thick pines. A modest wooden sign read, "St. Bellamy's Rest, in God's Hands." A woman in pale scrubs met them at the front door with a clipboard and an expression polished smooth by repetition. Her name was June. She had a syrupy voice that made Martha's skin itch. "Welcome, Mrs. Clayborne. You're going to love it here. Everyone says it's just like a retreat. We do puzzles, bingo, and there's a beautiful chapel right on site." Martha gave her daughter one last look, hoping for something certainty, guilt, anything that might resemble a thread to hold on to. Denise only smiled, kissed her cheek, and whispered, "You'll be safe here, Mom." Then she was gone. Inside, the lighting was dim but warm. Soft piano music played from nowhere, and the scent of lavender and bleach hung in the air. June guided Martha down a long corridor lined with framed paintings of saints and open windows with lace curtains that didn't move. "You'll be sharing with Mrs. Lorna for now. She's a sweetheart," June said, pushing open a door to a small room with twin beds and a single window facing a grove of pine trees. The woman lying on the far bed opened one eye and blinked slowly. "Another one," she said. Her voice was hoarse, like dry leaves. Then she closed her eyes again. That night, Martha didn't unpack. She lay on her side, watching the shadows crawl across the ceiling, listening to the rain tap against the glass. Something didn't feel right. It wasn't the room. It wasn't even the eerie silence of the hallway or the way the floor creaked in rhythm. It was something deeper, older, like the house itself had swallowed too many voices. At breakfast the next morning, a woman 2 tables over dropped her fork. No one moved to help. No one looked. It was as if the sound had not occurred. Martha picked it up and placed it on the table beside the woman's plate. The woman didn't thank her. She didn't even blink. June approached later with a smile and a small booklet. "We like to keep things orderly here, so please read over the community expectations," she said. "No shouting, no late, night wandering, and always attend chapel if your name is called." Martha nodded, but when June walked away, she flipped to the back of the booklet where someone had written in shaky pen, "The chapel is not what it seems." And that was the beginning. Morning drifted in slowly, a quiet gray light seeping through the curtains like a secret. Martha lay awake before the bell rang, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to Lorna's shallow breaths from the other bed. She hadn't spoken since their first meeting, just slept or pretended to. In this place, it was hard to tell the difference. The hallway outside buzzed faintly with the low murmur of slippers, wheels on tile, and the occasional cough. Martha rose, dressed slowly, and joined the shuffle to the dining room. She passed a small alcove with a grandfather clock that didn't tick, a fake vase of lilies, and a photo of a priest she didn't recognize. Underneath the glass was etched a phrase, "Rest comes through obedience." Breakfast was bland eggs and toast without butter. The same woman from yesterday stared at her plate again. No one spoke. A man at the end of the table tried to hum a tune and was met with a sharp glance from a nurse standing by the wall. Martha ate slowly, carefully watching. She noticed the way the staff lingered just long enough to discourage whispers, but never long enough to be questioned. When June passed her with the coffee pot, Martha offered a polite smile. "Is there a library?" she asked gently. June hesitated, then nodded. "There's a small one near the chapel. We don't really encourage long visits, though. Some of the books are outdated." Later that afternoon, she made her way toward the direction June had vaguely waved. The corridor grew narrower, and the smell shifted less lavender, more paper and damp wood. The library was more of a storage room, with sagging shelves and a single chair near the window. Dust lay heavy on the spines. She didn't find books worth reading, but she found something else. Tucked behind a stack of hymnals was a small, cloth-bound journal. Its cover was worn, its edges curled. She opened it. Only a few pages were filled. Most were blank. The handwriting inside was jagged, panicked. It wasn't a diary. It was more like a warning. Notes about odd schedules, certain patients who disappeared, a mention of something called the quiet room. One line was underlined 3 times. "Chapel nights are never what they seem." Martha held the journal against her chest for a moment, then slid it into the pocket of her cardigan. As she turned to leave, she nearly collided with June standing in the doorway. "Looking for something?" June asked, eyes narrow. "Just browsing," Martha said, steadying her breath. "Used to be a school teacher. Hard to break the habit." June's smile was stretched too wide. "Well, don't overexert yourself. Most of our guests prefer rest over reading." Good night. Back in her room, Lorna was sitting upright, staring at the wall. It was the first time Martha had seen her move since arriving. "They're watching us," Lorna murmured, not turning her head. Martha stood still. "Who is?" "The ones behind the glass. The ones who decide who goes next." Then she lay down again, as if the effort of speaking had drained her completely. That night, Martha didn't sleep. She sat on her bed, clutching the little journal, and watched the moonlight shifting through the trees outside. The wind made the pines sway, casting moving shadows on the walls like long, reaching arms. Somewhere down the hall, a door clicked, then another. Soft footsteps, a wheeled cart, a whisper. The silence at St. Bellamy's was never empty. It was always listening. The morning air inside St. Bellamy's felt colder than usual. Not from the temperature, but from something harder to name, like a room that had been emptied just moments before, but you didn't see it happen. Martha stirred beneath her stiff blanket, the corners of the journal still pressed under her pillow. She hadn't meant to fall asleep with it there, but sometime between the shifting of the wind and the echoing creak of footsteps in the hall, her eyes had given up the fight. Lorna was sitting up again, blankly combing her fingers through the air. Her hair hadn't been brushed. Her gaze was caught on a spot near the ceiling, unmoving. Martha didn't speak. Not yet. She dressed quietly and tucked the journal deeper into the sleeve of her sweater, wrapping the wool over it twice. Then she reached for her shoes, her hands pausing only when she caught the faint scent rising from the hall disinfectant, mixed with something sour. Not rotting, but wrong. A chemical sweetness that reminded her of old hospitals and forgotten wings. In the dining room, fewer people had gathered than the day before. 3 chairs were empty and neatly pushed in, as if no one had ever used them. One belonged to the man who had hummed, another to the woman with the vacant stare. The third had sat next to the kitchen door, occupied by a man whose hands trembled every time he lifted his spoon. No one asked. No one mentioned their absence. June moved about the room with less of her usual bounce, her eyes flickering to a clipboard tucked under her arm. The other aides seemed more hurried, more rehearsed. A tray clattered to the floor behind the serving line, but no one looked back. Martha bit into a piece of dry toast and chewed slowly, letting the taste of silence settle on her tongue. After breakfast, she wandered not aimlessly, but deliberately through parts of the facility she hadn't yet explored. Past the activity room with a fake fireplace and plastic dominoes, through a hallway filled with water-stained portraits of nameless donors, and down a short flight of stairs marked staff only. The sign was loose on its screws. She waited at the corner until no footsteps came, then eased the door open. A faint hum of old machinery welcomed boiler room sounds, or perhaps refrigeration units. The air was heavy with dust and the metallic scent of copper pipes. Shadows bent strangely along the walls. She walked slowly, trying not to let her shoes squeak. The hallway split into two. To the left, a locked utility door. To the right, another corridor, this one unlit and lined with door frames that bore no numbers, only small brass plates scratched beyond recognition. She turned right. The third door stood ajar. Inside was a room no bigger than a closet, but with restraints bolted to the walls and a chair that looked too much like something from a dentist's nightmare. A leather strap dangled from the armrest, stained. The air was colder here, still, as if nothing had moved in years, and yet something had happened just hours ago. She stepped back quickly, nearly bumping into someone. "Are you lost?" The voice was male. Calm, too calm. She turned slowly and found herself looking into the eyes of a man dressed in black slacks and a gray shirt. No name tag, no smile. "I was looking for the laundry," Martha lied, tightening her arms around her sweater. "You've gone too far. Guests aren't allowed past the main hallway." He didn't blink. She nodded quickly, eyes down. "I'm sorry. I must have turned the wrong way after breakfast." He said nothing, just gestured toward the stairs. Back in her room, Martha shut the door and stood for a long time, her breath shallow. She could feel her heart trying to beat out of her chest, her ears straining for any sign that she'd been followed. Nothing. Then, slowly, Lorna's voice broke the stillness. "Did you see it?" Martha turned. Lorna's eyes were clearer than before, focused. Her face, though worn, held a quiet intensity. "You've been here long?" Martha asked, lowering herself onto the edge of the bed. "Too long," Lorna whispered. "Long enough to know when the shadows change." Martha hesitated, then pulled out the journal. "Do you know who wrote this?" Lorna reached for it with both hands, but didn't open it. She just pressed it to her chest like it belonged to her. "I thought it was gone," she said. "They come for your things, eventually. First the trinkets, then your name." "What's the quiet room?" Lorna didn't answer at first. She closed her eyes, breathing through her nose like she was gathering strength. "They say it's therapy, a place to rest when you get too loud. But no one comes back the same, not completely." A knock at the door snapped them both to attention. It was June. "Ladies, time for chapel. Lorna, you've been requested to attend today." Lorna's face froze. "Requested?" Martha echoed. "What does that mean?" June's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Just a bit of prayer and reflection. It helps. Come." Lorna rose without protest, though her hands trembled. Martha watched her leave, clutching the journal in one arm like a shield. The door clicked shut. Martha sat still for a long time. When she finally moved, it was to reach under Lorna's bed. She didn't know what she was looking for, perhaps nothing, but her fingers brushed against something hard and cold. A key. It was small, flat, and old-fashioned. Whatever it unlocked, Martha was certain it wouldn't lead to serenity. It would lead to answers. And perhaps, finally, the truth. The key was smooth between her fingers, worn at the edges, as if passed through many hands over many years. Martha sat cross-legged on the carpet, holding it in her palm like it might speak to her if she listened long enough. It was small, perhaps to a drawer or a lockbox. But in a place like this, even a drawer could be a vault. The hallway beyond her door remained silent, but silence here was deceptive. She waited another full minute before rising and slipping the key into her sweater pocket. Her heart thudded steadily, not in panic, but with a quiet resolve that had started building the moment Lorna stepped out with June. She hadn't returned. Lorna had been gone since morning chapel, and lunch had passed without her. No one mentioned it. The staff moved briskly but smiled too much, as if they were compensating for a stain they couldn't quite scrub away. Martha moved down the hallway, slowly at first. She passed the photo of the unknown priest again. This time she paused. His eyes, beneath the frame's glass, seemed colder than she remembered. Not kind, not watchful, just still. There was no plaque with a name, just the phrase repeated beneath him. "Rest comes through obedience." At the far end of the east wing there was a room she hadn't dared enter before. It was locked, of course. She had tried the knob 2 days prior and felt it resist with an authority that said, "Not for you." Now, with the key resting against her palm, she stood in front of it again. She took a breath and slid the key into the lock. It turned without hesitation. The room beyond was not what she expected. It wasn't a supply closet or an office. It was a storage space, yes, but not for supplies. The air inside was thick with dust, as if no one had stepped in for years, yet nothing felt abandoned. The walls were lined with file cabinets, each tagged with names and numbers, hand-labeled in black marker. Old records, perhaps. Medical files. She closed the door behind her. There was a single bare bulb overhead, hanging low and flickering slightly. The cabinet closest to her was marked AB. She pulled it open. The files inside were thick and dense, labeled with names, photos clipped to the covers. She flipped through quickly, searching for something familiar until she found it. Clayborne, Martha, her own name, her photo taken just 2 days ago. The file included a checklist: cognitive evaluation, pending, consent status, presumed, transfer eligibility, flagged. At the bottom, in red ink, was a final note. Observe for resistance. She stepped back from the drawer, the blood draining from her arms. There were dozens more folders. Elise Whitmore, Roger Kinley, Marjorie Lennox, some with red dots beside the names, others with stamped words: retired, unfit, transferred. A creak came from the hallway. Martha froze. The key was still in the lock. She twisted it silently, just enough to seal the door without letting the latch click. The bulb above swayed slightly. Shadows jittered on the wall. Another creak, closer this time. Then footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. She ducked behind a tall metal shelf and crouched low. Her knees ached in protest, but she didn't move. The door handle turned. The door stayed closed. The handle turned again, this time more forcefully. But the key, mercifully, held. Then silence. After several moments, she heard the footsteps retreat. She stayed crouched longer than necessary, counting slowly to 30. When she emerged, her hands trembled, but her focus was sharp. She grabbed 3 more files at random and slipped them under her sweater. She didn't have time to read. Not here. As she pulled the door closed, she noticed something etched into the wood just beneath the frame, almost invisible, unless the light hit it just right. 5 words, scratched roughly into the surface. It's not God behind this. Back in her room, she bolted the door. The files lay on her bed like forbidden fruit. She opened one. Lorna Beecham. Inside was a copy of her birth certificate, a page from a psychologist's evaluation noting signs of inappropriate questioning and delusional behavior. Attached to the back was a transfer form signed, but dated for the end of the month. The location: Marrow Ridge Facility, Restricted Unit. She turned to her window. The pine trees whispered secrets she could almost understand now. She had no idea where Marrow Ridge was, but the word restricted lingered in her mind like a bruise. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Not June. A lighter, gentler knock. 3 short taps. Martha opened the door a crack. A boyno older than 20 stood there in janitor scrubs, eyes darting side to side. His name tag read Colin. "You've been asking the wrong questions," he whispered, "and that means you're getting close." She didn't speak. "I can't talk long. Cameras don't work in the library, but everywhere else." "What happened to Lorna?" He hesitated. "They call it quiet care, but it's just sedation. Makes them easier to move." "Move where?" "They never say. But I hear things. Doors opening late at night, vans pulling around the back. I tried to stop one once. They gave me kitchen duty for a month and sent a letter to my dad saying I was unstable." Martha stepped aside. "Come in." He shook his head. "If I'm caught, I'll disappear faster than Lorna. But I want to help. There's a chapel record book, sign-in logs. They hide it in the sacristy cabinet. When? Tomorrow night, after prayer. I'll distract June. You look." And with that, he turned and vanished down the hall, broom in hand, posture straightening into casual compliance as if nothing had happened. Martha closed the door gently behind him. Her pulse throbbed in her ears, but there was clarity in her mind. Each step forward peeled away a layer of sweetness, revealing something darker and more deliberate underneath. Tomorrow night. The chapel. If there were names in that book, and if she found Lorna's written last, she'd know what came next. And this time she wouldn't wait quietly. That night, Martha barely touched her dinner. The meatloaf was gray and soft at the edges, the carrots boiled to mush, but it wasn't the food that kept her stomach still. Her mind was already in the chapel, tracing the angles of the sacristy cabinet, imagining what the logbook might look like leather-bound, perhaps, with delicate handwriting and columns of names waiting to be found, names of the lost, names of the next. Across the table, June was speaking softly to another resident, smiling too brightly. Her eyes never stayed on one face long. Martha noticed how her glance flickered toward her every few minutes, like a tick. It was subtle, but consistent, a rhythm. She wondered if June suspected, or worse knew. After the meal, everyone was guided back to their rooms. Martha followed the stream of walkers and wheelchairs without protest, nodding when spoken to, moving when told. Once inside her room, she closed the door and leaned against it, breathing slowly through her nose. The air felt heavier than usual, the silence more pronounced. On the bed lay the 3 files she had taken. She had read through each one earlier, memorizing what she could. Each patient had a similar pattern: medical evaluations, cognitive tests, then a note about declining compatibility. Always followed by a transfer recommendation. She traced her finger over a name, Roger Kinley, and felt a chill when she remembered his shaking hands at breakfast just days before. His file was marked moved. The hallway bell chimed once. Chapel call. She tucked the files under her mattress, adjusted her sweater, and stepped into the corridor. The other residents walked slowly toward the chapel, forming a line of stooped shoulders and shuffling shoes. No one spoke. The walls flickered with the soft golden light of sconces, giving the illusion of warmth where there was only order. Colin stood by the chapel doors, mop in hand, whistling a tuneless melody. He gave her a brief glance, not long enough to draw attention, but enough to confirm he remembered. Inside, the chapel smelled of wax and something older, like mothballs and damp velvet. Pews lined either side of a central aisle. A modest altar stood at the front, flanked by statues of saints whose eyes were downcast, unseeing. She took her usual seat near the back. June entered last and sat with the other staff at the side. Her hands were folded perfectly in her lap. A hymn played through unseen speakers, something soft and slow, but without soul. When the music ended, a voice came over the sound system. Father Ellison, the head of the facility, though Martha had only seen him once, from a distance. His sermon was brief. Something about surrender, about quietness, about finding peace through structure. She barely heard the words. Her heart was beating hard, not from fear, but from something sharper. A sense of time slipping. Colin moved near the side door during the final prayer. When everyone bowed their heads, she slipped away. She moved along the wall, her steps quick but soundless. The sacristy door was slightly ajar. She slid inside, easing the wood shut behind her. The room was small and cold, filled with cabinets and candle holders, folded robes, a tarnished chalice on a side table. Against the far wall stood the cabinet. She opened it. Inside was a single leather-bound book. No title. She lifted it gently and set it on the counter. Her fingers moved fast, flipping through the pages. Names, dates, times. Each line was neatly written, recorded in loops of old-fashioned script. Most were marked with a check, some with a line through them, and a few with a red mark at the end. She didn't know what the marks meant yet. She found Lorna's name on the third-to-last page. Lorna Beecham, sex, noll, assigned. The word hit her like a sudden wind. Below it, Roger Kinley, 5:30 a.m., completed. Below that, Martha Clayborne, pending review. No time, no date, but her name was there. She stepped back from the book, breath-catching. That meant someone had already decided, or was deciding. Now, behind her, the door creaked. She turned, heart slamming into her throat. Colin stood there, pale and tense. You need to go. Now. I distracted June, but she's not alone tonight. Martha nodded. She grabbed the book, hesitated, then tore out the last page and folded it into her pocket. She slid the book back and followed him out the back hallway of the chapel, through a narrow passage that smelled of stone and mildew. They exited into the night. The air outside was cold and clean. Pines loomed in every direction, tall and silent. The gravel path under their feet crunched softly as they walked. "You need proof," he whispered. "Not just records, something no one can deny." "What does that mean?" He hesitated. "The basement." She stopped walking. "I heard about it from the groundskeeper. He's gone now. Told me they used it before renovations but never sealed it. There's a locked stairwell at the end of the east hallway. You need the brass key." Martha touched her sweater. "I have a key." "Not that one," he said. "That one opens records. The brass key opens what they want to forget. How do I find it?" He looked around, cautious. "It hangs from June's belt. I've seen it." She didn't speak. "You can't go tonight," he added. "They'll notice. Tomorrow after dinner. I'll help." He turned to leave, blending into the dark like a ghost. Back in her room, Martha undressed slowly. Her hands were trembling now. Not from fear, but from certainty. The kind that came when you realized there was no turning back. She took the torn page from her pocket and read it again. Her name, Lorna's Rogers. Assigned. Completed. Pending review. She folded the paper tightly and slid it under the lining of her shoe. If they came for her tonight, it would be the only thing she could carry. Then she lay down in her bed, staring at the ceiling. The silence around her was thick and knowing, and somewhere beneath the floor, past a brass lock and a stairwell, the truth was waiting. So was the end of pretending. Morning came slow and gray. Mist hung low outside the window, curling around the pines like it was trying to listen in. Martha sat up in bed with the weight of the night still clinging to her shoulders. Sleep had come in fits fragments of voices, a memory of Lorna's name written in slanted ink, and the faint echo of footsteps pacing beyond her door. She dressed without rushing. If she moved too quickly, they'd notice. If she hesitated, they'd sense fear. So she moved deliberately, brushing her hair into a loose knot, slipping the folded page from her shoe and tucking it into the hem of her pillowcase. She could almost hear her late husband's voice, calm and dry, warning her, "Careful, Martha. No one pays attention to someone slow and kind." At breakfast, the dining room felt thinner. Not in numbers every chair was filled, but in presence. The air was stiffer, the eyes less focused. People stirred their oatmeal with the same slow circles, but there was something missing behind their movements, like a current that had gone still beneath the surface. June was there, of course, gliding between tables with her careful smile. But Martha noticed something new. Hanging from her waist, beside the ID badge and a loop of small plastic keys, was one key that shone different, heavier, brass. It swung gently with every step, catching the light each time she turned. Martha marked the rhythm. After breakfast, she returned to her room. The hallway was quiet, save for the distant hum of a vacuum and the low trill of a bell echoing faintly from the west wing. She pretended to read, one of the old gardening magazines from the lounge folded open on her lap, her eyes flicking to the clock every few minutes. Time passed like honey down a cold spoon. Dinner came and went without event. The menu was chicken with soft peas and butterless rice. Nobody talked. The only sound was silverware brushing porcelain. The television in the next room played a muted game show with too many colors. And still, Martha waited. It was near dusk when Colin passed by her doorway. No words, just a glance, and a slight tilt of his chin. The signal. She slipped out with him a few minutes later, joining the trail of residents headed toward the common room. Most gathered for evening hymn-timey, an unspoken requirement wrapped in polite suggestion. But Martha broke away at the turn near the east wing, her steps sure but unhurried. Colin met her outside the laundry closet. "She's in the office," he whispered. 15 minutes max. She locks the desk drawer but not the hook." He handed her something wrapped in gauze, a pair of scissors, short and dull but good enough. "Wait 3 seconds after I walk past," he said. "I'll distract the nurse on duty. You'll have to be fast." Then he was gone. Martha waited, counted to 10. Then 3 more. She moved. The hallway was empty. The office door cracked just enough to show no light. She slid inside, shut it behind her, and crossed to the coat rack where June's belt and jacket hung neatly. The keys jingled softly as she lifted the loop. Her fingers worked quickly, freeing the brass key and slipping it into her pocket before rehanging the rest. Then she turned, heart pounding, and stepped back into the hall like nothing had happened. She didn't go straight to the stairwell. She waited. Back in her room she paced. Not quickly, but enough to keep her thoughts from racing ahead of her body. At midnight, she slipped out again. The building sunk into its unnatural stillness. Lights dimmed. No footsteps. Just the hum of generators and the occasional groan of old walls. At the end of the east wing, past the framed photos and the fake floral arrangements, stood a door she had never seen opened. Metal. Plain. Marked only by a tiny label. Maintenance. Authorized personnel only. She slid the brass key into the lock. It turned with a faint click. The door opened onto a stairwell of concrete and steel. The air was thick, unmoving. Cold rose in waves from below. No light reached past the third step. She closed the door gently behind her and began to descend. Each step echoed. Not loudly, but deeply. Like her footfalls were entering a space that hadn't heard sound in years. The walls narrowed. The air turned damp. Pipes lined the ceiling, some rusted, some sweating. A faint buzz of electricity filtered down from above, but no bulbs lit the path. She moved slowly, her hand brushing the wall to guide her. At the bottom, she found a corridor. The floor was bare concrete, stained in places. 4 doors lined the right-hand wall. Each painted white once, now flaking and gray. There were no windows, no signs, just a hum. A low, mechanical sound. Like the breath of a machine trying to sleep. She reached the first door. It was unlocked. Inside was a small room, barely larger than a closet. A mattress on the floor. No bed frame. No blankets. Just the imprint of a body long since gone. The second door opened onto the same. The third room was different. There were straps on the wall. A wooden chair with buckles on the arms. A shelf lined with syringes, all neatly arranged. A tray beside them with empty vials labeled only with numbers. She turned away, bile rising. The fourth room was locked. She crouched beside it, pressing her ear to the seam. No sound, no movement, but she didn't need to open it. She already knew. This place wasn't for healing. It wasn't even for control. It was for disappearance. As she stood, something caught her eye, a clipboard hanging from a nail outside the third room. It held a list. Names, dates, room assignments. Roger Kinley, room 2. Completed. Elise Whitmore, room 1. Completed. Lorna Beecham, room 3. Delayed. Martha Clayborne, pending. She stood there for a long moment, staring at her own name as if it belonged to someone else. The concrete floor beneath her felt like ice, but her thoughts were clear. This was the center. The root. She had proof now, not just stories, but records. A system. A routine. She turned and began the climb back up, one slow step at a time. Her legs ached. Her throat burned with words she hadn't said. Her hands tightened around the page she tore from the clipboard and folded small in her palm. Back in her room, she slid the evidence beneath her mattress and closed her eyes without lying down. Sleep wouldn't come tonight. But tomorrow? Tomorrow she would speak. And if they came for her first, well, then they'd finally learn that silence wasn't the only thing Martha Clayborne had mastered. When morning came, it brought no relief. The sun hung behind a wall of pale clouds, turning the windows into mirrors that offered no warmth and reflected only the quiet faces inside. Martha sat at the edge of her bed, fully dressed, her back straight as a flagpole. She didn't touch the breakfast tray that someone had slid into her room. She no longer trusted what came on plastic plates with chipped rims and no scent. She waited. For what, exactly, she couldn't say. Perhaps for the courage to act, or perhaps for a sign that she wouldn't have to. It was nearly 9 when she heard the knock. 3 quick taps followed by silence. Colin. She opened the door just enough to let him slip in. He closed it gently behind him, his eyes scanning the hallway with practiced caution. He looked pale, his brown mop of hair slightly damp, as if he'd been sweating. "They know something happened," he whispered. "They did a room check at dawn. Didn't open anything, just looked too long." Martha nodded. She moved to her mattress, lifted the corner, and pulled out the page from the clipboard. "This is enough. With the logbook copy and the patient files, it paints a full picture." Colin frowned. "It's not just about proving it. It's about surviving long enough to tell it." She studied his face. the shadows under his eyes, the sharpness of his jaw from skipped meals. "You're scared. I'd be stupid not to be." Quote. They sat in silence for a long moment, the hum of the building wrapped around them like a soft warning. "I want to get out," Colin said at last. "But if I leave alone, I'll vanish like the rest. They'll say I ran, got unstable, maybe even blame you." Martha folded the paper carefully and slipped it into the lining of her sleeve. "Then we don't run. Not yet." He tilted his head. "What are you thinking? We go public. From the inside." "You mean call someone? Number?" "I mean get it into the hands of someone they can't stop. Media. Someone outside their chain of silence." Colin hesitated. "How?" "There's a mail drop at the front desk. It gets picked up twice a week by a courier. If I can get a package into that pile, it leaves this place." His eyes widened. "You want to smuggle out evidence?" She nodded. "I've taught kids for 30 years, Colin. I know how to pass notes without being seen." For the first time that morning, he smiled. That afternoon, Martha walked the halls with her usual pace, a little slower than normal, just enough to stay invisible. She made small talk with the nurse she despised, complimented June's lavender brooch, even laughed softly when someone in the lounge told a joke she couldn't hear. In her room, she used one of the stationery envelopes provided for family letters. Into it, she placed the torn chapel log, copies of patient files, and the room assignment sheet from the basement. She wrote a brief note on top. "To whom it may concern, this is not a nursing home. It is a pipeline. Please read everything, and if you still sleep well afterward, you were never alive to begin with." She addressed the envelope to a newspaper office in Helena. Colin had given her the name and signed it only with her initials. Then she waited for the evening. Dinner came and went. She joined the others in the lounge afterward, folding napkins into tiny triangles while the television droned on with weather updates. June came and went, all smiles and measured steps, and when she wasn't looking, Martha slipped the envelope into the mail drop. Just like that. Gone. She didn't celebrate, didn't sigh with relief. She knew too much for that. The moment it left her hand, everything changed. There was no longer safety in stillness. Now came the part where silence could kill. That night, she dreamed of voices without faces, of hands reaching from behind curtains, of Lorna calling her name from behind a wall she couldn't see through. She woke with her hand clenched around nothing, breath catching like she'd been underwater. There was a sound at her door. A soft knock, not Colin's pattern. Not staff. One knock. Pause. Another. Martha rose, her heart thudding. She stepped quietly to the door and listened. Nothing but the steady whir of air vents and a faint rustle, like someone shifting fabric nearby. She opened the door an inch. A folded piece of paper lay on the floor. She bent to pick it up, then closed the door quickly. Unfolding it under the reading lamp, she read, "You should not have gone downstairs." There was no signature. Only that. She read it twice more, then tore it in half and flushed it. By morning, something in the atmosphere had shifted. Residents were kept in their rooms longer. June made no rounds. Breakfast was brought in silence. And when Martha tried to leave for her usual walk, a staff member she didn't recognize blocked the hallway. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Common areas are closed this morning. Routine maintenance." She nodded, returned to her room, and sat at the window. Something was coming. She felt it in her ribs, in the way the birds outside refused to land, in how the pines stood so still they looked like cardboard props. By afternoon, the intercom buzzed. All residents are asked to remain in their rooms until further notice. Thank you for your cooperation. Colin didn't appear. Neither did the mail courier. She didn't know if that meant success or exposure. And so she waited. Again. Waited with her heart in her throat and her hands folded in her lap, like she'd been taught long ago in a classroom that felt so far away it might have been another life. And outside her window, something rustled in the trees. Not the wind. Something else. The sky was the color of cold ash by the time Martha heard the sound again. Not the soft hush of wind, but the distinct drag of shoes across polished floor. Then a click the latch of a door not far from hers. She stood without thinking, the motion now practiced, instinctual. She moved to the door, pressed her ear to the wood, a voice low and sharp not meant for her. Something about compliance, another about reassessment. She didn't dare open it. Instead, she stepped away and returned to her chair by the window, settling in just as the footsteps passed. Through the thin line of light under the door, she watched a shadow drift by. It paused, held, then moved on. They were watching her, that much was certain. And still, Colin hadn't appeared. That, more than anything, unsettled her. He was cautious but constant. Every day since their first exchange he had shown himself, not always close, not always with words, but he had made himself known. And now nothing. She looked again to the clock, nearly 9 p.m. The halls remained sealed. The intercom had stayed silent since the morning announcement. The facility pulsed with an eerie stillness, like it was holding its breath. She turned on the bedside lamp and retrieved the list from beneath her mattress. The paper had softened, worn thin at the creases from too many readings. She didn't need it anymore, not truly. It was burned into her memory, but she held it anyway. A kind of shield, or a vow. A soft tap at her window made her startle. It was absurd. She knew the room was on the second floor, and the pines weren't close enough for branches to reach. Another tap. She rose slowly, walked to the curtain, and drew it back an inch. Nothing but night. She stared for a long moment before letting the fabric fall back into place. Her mind was too sharp to invent things, but exhaustion carried its own hallucinations. She returned to her seat and sat once more. Then, a slip of paper appeared under the door. It came silently. No footsteps, no shadow. Just a small, folded square pushed across the linoleum like it had a will of its own. She moved quickly, locked the door, then retrieved the note. Her fingers hesitated over the crease. Inside, 2 words had been written in a rushed, uneven scrawl. They moved him. There was no name, no context. But she knew. Colin. Her chest tightened. She gripped the chair's armrest until her knuckles ached. They had found out. Somehow. Or maybe they had always known. Maybe they had let him act, let her dig, just far enough to see who else might reach for the truth. She paced, restless. A caged rhythm built in her legs. She couldn't stay still, couldn't just sit and wait for the next shoe to fall. She needed to see. Slipping on her sweater, she slid the brass key into her pocket. The building had quieted beyond the usual. No televisions, no distant laughter, no clink of dishes in the kitchen. Even the mechanical hum felt dampened, as if the walls had been asked to listen, and they obeyed. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway. No alarm, no warning, but the lighting was dimmer than usual, the sconces flickering like candles on their last breath. She walked slowly, passing the nurse's station, now unstaffed, the desk chair pushed back just slightly. A coffee mug rested on the counter, steam long since vanished. At the end of the corridor near the chapel, a door stood open. One she'd never seen ajar before. It led to a stairwell she hadn't explored. Not down this time, but up. She climbed. The steps curved tight, the ceiling lowering with each floor until she had to hunch slightly. At the top, a small door opened onto a narrow hallway with 3 rooms, all closed. No signs. The walls were bare, not even the usual framed landscapes. She approached the first door and turned the knob. Locked. Second. Also locked. The third gave way. Inside was a room unlike any she had seen in St. Bellamy's Bright. Sterile. Walls painted a too clean white. A single bed, perfectly made. A chair. And on the far wall a glass window, tinted slightly, like the kind you'd find in police stations. She stepped inside. It smelled faintly of antiseptic and something floral artificial and too sweet. Then a sound. A shuffling breath. She turned sharply. Behind the glass, in the adjacent room, was a figure. Slumped in a chair, wearing gray scrubs, his face pale, hair damp. Wrists resting limp in his lap. Colin. He didn't move when she stepped closer, didn't respond when she pressed her hand to the glass. His eyes were open, barely. She banged the glass lightly. Whispered his name. Nothing. Then, behind her, a click. The door. She spun around. June stood in the hallway, flanked by a man in dark clothing, tall, expressionless. "You shouldn't be here," June said, voice quiet. Martha stared at her. "What have you done to him?" June stepped forward slowly, folding her hands in front of her. "He was unstable. He's being evaluated. This isn't a punishment. You drugged him. He threatened the safety of the environment, of our residents. You don't understand the burden of care, Mrs. Clayborne. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is quiet the mind. Martha laughed short, sharp, almost bitter. Is that what you call it now? Quieting? Funny. All this time I thought that was just another word for erasing. The man stepped forward. June held up a hand. You've been through a lot, she said. We've tried to help, but it's clear now that you're fixated. You're scared, Martha said calmly, because I sent it. June's face twitched. The smile faltered. Yes, Martha continued. Everything. It's gone. Out of here. Delivered. Someone on the outside knows what's happening in your basement. For the first time, June didn't speak. Instead, she turned to the man and nodded once. He stepped past Martha, into the observation room, and closed the door behind him. Martha shouted, slapped the glass. But Colin didn't move. The man leaned close, blocking her view. June touched her arm. Come with me, please. Let's not make this worse than it already is. Martha looked at the hallway behind her. There were no other exits. She let them lead her back down the stairs, her body numb but her mind blazing. She knew now there were no rules here, only roles. And when the players stopped cooperating, they were rewritten or removed. But the story was out. It was out, and nothing would stop what was coming next. The hallway back to her room felt longer than before. Each step Martha took echoed faintly, the sound swallowed by the padded hush of the walls. June walked beside her with that practiced serenity, hands clasped at her waist, like nothing out of place had just occurred. The man in black followed a few paces behind, silent as a shadow. Martha said nothing. Not because she had no words, but because she knew they wanted a reaction. A crack. A sign that fear had taken root. She gave them none. When they reached her door, June paused and looked at her with eyes that tried to soften. You should rest. We'll bring you something warm to help you sleep. Martha didn't respond. June tilted her head slightly, a smile tucked into the corner of her mouth. Sometimes people misunderstand mercy when it comes wrapped in rules. Martha stepped inside, and sometimes evil learns how to dress like compassion. The door shut behind her. She locked it. She didn't sit. She paced. The image of Colin slumped, half-conscious, trapped behind glass flashed over and over in her mind. His eyes, dull from something chemical. His stillness, unnatural. She had seen that look before in patients years ago, in hospice units, in her own husband's final days, but this was different. He wasn't dying. They had pressed pause on him, rendered him mute in body while his thoughts screamed from inside. She moved to the nightstand, retrieved the envelope with the chapel record, the patient notes, the clipboard sheet. All still there, hidden in the lining of a tissue box, beneath the tray in her drawer, behind the baseboard panel loosened just enough to slide paper into. They hadn't searched yet. That meant they were still deciding what to do, or how far they could go without setting off a fire. She returned to the window and stared out at the trees. A breeze had picked up. The branches shifted like they were nodding, whispering things only the earth could hear. In the far distance, past the trees, she could see a highway. Barely. That line of movement cars, trucks, drivers oblivious became her anchor. The world outside still existed. And someone out there had her letter. Her evidence. Her plea. She didn't know who it had reached or what they would do with it, but the idea that it had escaped gave her just enough air to breathe. Then the intercom crackled. Attention residents. Chapel attendance this evening is mandatory. All will gather in the sanctuary at 6:30. Martha turned slowly toward the speaker. They weren't subtle anymore. Mandatory. For all. She looked at the clock. It was just after 5. They were giving her time. Enough to stew. Enough to worry. It was a show, and she was about to walk into it. She sat on the edge of the bed, fingers wrapped around the edge of the mattress. Her knees bounced slightly, not from nerves, but from energy, focus. She reached down, peeled open the heel of her shoe, and slipped in the smallest folded document she had. The rest, she would leave behind. If they planned to silence her, she wouldn't make it easy. At 6:25, she stepped into the hallway. Other residents were already moving toward the chapel, escorted one by one. 2 aides walked beside a woman in a wheelchair who stared at the floor. Another man with trembling hands was gently guided forward, nodding blankly. They moved like shadows. Martha walked without help. The sanctuary glowed with soft light, more golden than usual. Someone had placed candles at the altar, not the plastic ones they used for decoration, but real wax flickering, fragile, giving the illusion of peace. She took her seat near the middle, flanked by 2 other women who didn't look at her. The rows filled slowly. Aides lined the walls. The man in black from earlier stood by the front door. June approached the altar and tapped the microphone. "Thank you for joining us this evening," she began, her voice smooth as glass. "We gather not only to give thanks, but to reflect. Sometimes we stray. We forget the blessings of structure, of surrender, of shared quiet." Martha didn't blink. "We're grateful," June continued, "for those who help guide others back into alignment." The room was silent. Then the double doors at the back opened, and Father Ellison entered. It was the first time Martha had seen him up close. He was younger than expected. Clean-shaven, dark suit, hair combed neatly to the side. But his eyes were cold. Not cruel, not unkind, just devoid. Like he had spent too long not listening and had forgotten how to hear. He stepped to the pulpit and placed both hands on its sides. "There are times," he said, voice calm, deliberate, "when we are tested, when resistance disguises itself as righteousness, when confusion hides in cleverness." Martha clenched her jaw. "We are here tonight," he said, "to witness renewal, to welcome back one who strayed." The doors opened again. 2 aides rolled in a wheelchair. Colin. His head was tilted forward. His arms were draped over his lap, his eyes half open but not focused. A quiet gasp moved through the rows. Father Ellison raised a hand. "This young man," he said, "lost his way, but he has returned to us, to order, to peace." Martha stood. No one moved. She stepped into the aisle. All eyes turned. June's smile froze. "I object," Martha said. Her voice was steady. "I object to the lie. I object to the performance. And I object to the idea that peace is something you can inject, or silence is something you can force." The room held its breath. Father Ellison blinked. "This is not a courtroom," he said. "No," she said. "It's a theater, and you've written the same scene so many times you've forgotten the ending." A murmur stirred. The aides tensed. Martha stepped forward again. "I sent everything, every file, every page, every name. They're already reading it. And when they come, they won't knock politely." Father Ellison glanced toward June. "Remove her," June ordered. 2 aides stepped forward. And then, the chapel doors burst open. A voice called out, "Federal authorities." Everyone remained seated. Chaos broke instantly. The aides froze mid-step. Father Ellison's hands dropped from the pulpit. June turned pale. Men in dark jackets entered, one by one. Behind them, a woman in plain clothes, holding a file. Martha's file. "We received your letter," she said to Martha. "We've been investigating for weeks. Yours was the final piece." Martha closed her eyes. Colin, still silent in his chair, sat unmoving as the agents approached. But she saw it. A twitch in his right hand. A sign. The light, however small, had returned. The moment the chapel filled with federal agents, the illusion shattered. It didn't collapse all at Oncino. It fractured slowly, like glass under pressure. The residents stayed frozen, uncertain whether to feel relief or fear. Some turned toward Martha with wide eyes, others simply stared at the ground, too conditioned to lift their heads. For many of them, hope had long since been filed away under unrealistic. Quote. Martha stood in the center aisle, heart still hammering from adrenaline, but her gaze steady. The woman in plain clothes approached her, holding a folder wrapped in a rubber band. It was thick, familiar. "We've reviewed the contents," she said quietly, "and corroborated much of it with prior complaints. Your evidence helped confirm a pattern we suspected but couldn't prove." Quote. Behind them, agents moved with precision, speaking softly, separating staff from residents, gathering computers, unlocking doors. One moved toward Colin's chair, knelt beside him, and began checking his vitals. Martha watched closely. "Is he?" "He's alive," the agent said. "Sedated, but stable." Something unclenched in Martha's chest. Two agents approached June. Her composure cracked for the first time. Her hands trembled slightly as they took her clipboard and escorted her away from the front of the chapel. She didn't resist, but her eyes found Martha's, and for a moment, the room fell silent again. She didn't speak, but the message was there. You shouldn't have won. Martha met her gaze, unflinching. You never should have tried. They moved the residents out in waves. Some were taken by ambulance, others placed under observation. A few had no names to call, no family to alert, just a number assigned by the system. Martha stayed near the door, offering quiet words to those who passed. One woman clutched her hand like a lifeline, whispering thank you again and again. It wasn't over, but something had broken, and that meant it could never go back to how it was. Outside, the pines swayed in the wind, their limbs no longer hiding shadows, but letting in pale streaks of fading sun. The evening light bled orange along the horizon. For the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like a painting hung to mask decay. Martha helped guide a few of the women into the transport vans. The younger agents moved with kindness but caution, unsure whether they were dealing with witnesses or victims or both. Back inside, an agent approached her again. We've identified a basement facility, he said. Exactly where you described. Holding rooms, medication logs, a second set of medical charts. I've seen it, she replied. I could walk it with my eyes closed. He nodded. We'll need a full statement. Testimony, if it goes that far. It always goes that far, Martha said. She returned to her room just as the sun disappeared behind the trees. It was quiet now, not forced silence, but the kind that follows the end of something. She sat on her bed, ran a hand along the blanket's edge, and finally allowed herself a moment to feel everything. Grief, relief, exhaustion. She didn't cry. Not then. There would be time for tears later, when names were read, when stories were published, when Colin opened his eyes and remembered everything. She lay back on the pillow and stared at the ceiling. For a long time she had imagined this moment as victory, but it didn't feel like winning. It felt like surviving. And that, she realized, was enough. The next day came with reporters. Vans lined the road in front of St. Bellamy's, microphones, camera crews, headlines scrolling across the bottom of screens. Local nursing home exposed in federal abuse investigation. Anonymous whistleblower leads to major facility shutdown. Some outlets called it a scandal, others called it a tragedy. Very few called it what it really was: systemic. Martha watched from the library, seated in the corner by the dusty window. It was the first time she'd returned to that room since discovering the journal. Someone had taken it, the original probably swept up during the search. But she still remembered every word, every shaky line written in fear. She hoped the agents had read it, not just filed it. An agent knocked softly on the doorframe. Sorry to interrupt, he said. There's someone here to see you. Quote. She followed him through the hallway, now lined with temporary boxes and folding tables, the place halfway between shutdown and transformation. At the front entrance, a young woman stood with a notepad and a nervous smile. Mrs. Clayborne? She asked. I'm a reporter with the Herald. I'd like to tell your story. In your words. Martha hesitated. It wasn't that she didn't want to speak. It was that the weight of the story still sat so close to her chest, she wasn't sure how to pull it free without unraveling. She motioned to the bench outside. They sat together, and the young woman opened her notebook. You're the reason this all came out. Why did you come forward? Martha looked out toward the pines. They whispered, but no longer menacingly. Just trees now. Just wind. I was tired of being quiet, she said, and someone had to be first. Quote. The woman nodded, scribbling quickly. What do you want people to know? Martha paused, her fingers laced in her lap. That not all prisons have bars, and not all monsters wear cruelty on their faces. She stood after a while, the interview over. Before she walked away, she added, print the truth, not just the facts. The woman promised she would. Later that evening, Martha visited the medical trailer where Colin was recovering. He hadn't woken yet, but his pulse was stronger. The nurse told her he stirred in his sleep sometimes, murmuring broken words. She sat beside him, fingers lightly brushing his hand. You're not gone, she whispered. They tried, but they failed. She stayed until the stars came out, until the world outside felt quiet again. Then she returned to her room. That night, for the first time in years, Martha Clayborne dreamed of nothing. And woke without fear. The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm both unfamiliar and disorienting. St. Bellamy's no longer moved like a prison cloaked in politeness. It had become something else entirely. A liminal space. Part sanctuary. Part crime scene. The building breathed differently now. Gone were the ghostly routines and whispered threats. In their place came the steady churn of truth being unboxed. Federal agents moved in and out, cataloging every hallway, every cabinet, every hidden room Martha had only guessed at. They peeled back layers of deception, and with each folder unearthed, each witness located, the silence that had once ruled St. Bellamy's fractured further. But for Martha, the noise inside was only beginning. She hadn't spoken to June again. Last she heard, she was being held pending charges: unlawful sedation, medical fraud, obstruction. The list was long, and rightly so. Father Ellison had vanished the night after the agents arrived. No one admitted to seeing him leave, but the car that had always been parked by the chapel entrance was gone. The quiet was his signature, absence, his confession. Still, justice wasn't the kind of thing Martha believed in blindly anymore. Not the kind printed on brochures or promised by smooth voices in polished suits. Real justice, she'd come to understand, wasn't loud. It was slow, relentless, built by ordinary people who refused to stay quiet. She spent most of her time by Colin's bedside. His progress was slow. Each day, his breathing deepened. His fingers twitched more regularly. His eyes fluttered open and closed like a door learning how to stay ajar. On the fourth day, as she sat beside him with a worn paperback in her lap, he blinked slowly and turned his head. "Martha," he murmured. She didn't move at first. Her chest rose unsesherpleth and stilled. "I'm here," she said softly, reaching for his hand. He tried to speak again, but the words failed him. Still, she saw it, the clarity in his gaze, the question behind it. "You're safe," she whispered. "They can't touch you now." Tears welled in his eyes but didn't fall. That was enough. News vans still circled the building from time to time, though fewer than before. The initial shock had passed, replaced by new headlines, new outrage. But those who had followed closely, those who understood the scope of what had been uncovered, they stayed. Advocates, lawyers, survivors. One afternoon, a woman named Elise came to visit. She had once been listed in one of the patient files Martha stole. Declared unfit. Quieted into a room with no light. She was different now. Strong, upright, holding a binder full of names. "There are more," Elise said, sitting beside her in the sunroom. "Other homes, other resting places. They use different names, different owners, but the signs are the same." Martha nodded. She had suspected as much. "I want to build something," Elise continued. "A network. Not just support but accountability, whistleblowers, legal aid, education for families." Martha looked out the window, where sunlight filtered through the branches. "Let me help." "Come new." "You've done enough," Elise said gently. "No," Martha said. "I've started." "That's not the same." One evening, as dusk pooled in the corners of the building, Martha returned to the chapel. No one had used it since the night everything broke open. The pews were dusty, the altar stripped bare, the organ sat silent, a polished carcass. She walked slowly to the front and stood where Father Ellison once delivered his sermons. Then she turned and looked out at the empty seats. She didn't speak aloud, but in her mind, she spoke to every woman who had sat there before her, to every name that had vanished off a clipboard, to every voice reduced to a line of ink. "I remember you," she thought, "and I will carry you forward." Then she noticed it tucked into the hymnals along the left pew. A photograph, black and white, edges curling. A group of women in uniform standing in front of the old building, smiling, stiff. One in the back had her arms crossed, jaw set firm. Martha turned the photo over. In faint pencil were 3 words. "We tried first." Her breath caught. There had been others. Maybe years ago, maybe decades. They had resisted too. Maybe they had fallen, or disappeared, or been buried under false diagnoses and unmarked transfers. But they had tried. She slipped the photo into her pocket. Now they wouldn't be forgotten. The following morning, Martha met with Elise again. They talked for hours about process, about records, about funding. At one point, Colin joined them, still weak but alert. He didn't speak much, just listened. Occasionally, he nodded, his eyes sharper than anyone expected. By afternoon, a plan had formed, a foundation for what would come next. Not a revenge. Not a war. A reckoning. One based in truth. Relentless, patient, and unafraid. When Martha finally returned to her room that evening, the air felt different. Lighter. She sat at her desk and opened a blank page. At the top, in firm strokes, she wrote, Hope Registry, Phase 1. Then, beneath that, 1. Names. 2. Dates. 3. Places they were sent. 4. What we remember. She stopped. Then added, 5. What they took. 6. What they couldn't. And she smiled. Not because it was over, but because something better had begun. It started with a name, then another, and another. By the end of that week, Martha's notebook held 17. Each one written in the same careful script she had used to grade elementary school essays decades ago. These weren't just people, they were testimonies, shards of memory reclaimed from silence. Some were names she had seen before on files, on clipboards, on bed charts that had mysteriously vanished. Others came from whispered confessions in hallways or from new visitors who arrived at St. Bellamy's once the dust had begun to settle. The walls of the building were no longer haunted by compliance, but by questions, and Martha had decided she would be the one to collect the answers. Elise visited daily now, always with fresh folders tucked under her arm, her movements brisk, her mind focused. She had turned grief into momentum. Together they had formed a rhythm. Elise tracked paperwork. Martha interviewed. Colin, recovering steadily, built a database on a borrowed laptop the agents had cleared for use. One morning, a nurse brought Martha a letter, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a folded sheet and a photograph of a girl in her 20s, smiling nervously beside an older woman in a garden. The note read, My mother was at St. Bellamy's in 1987. She died within 6 months. They said it was natural causes, but I've always had doubts. I never got to say goodbye. If you're doing what I think you are, please, don't stop. Martha stared at the photo for a long time. Then she slipped it into the growing binder and wrote down the woman's name, Evelyn Hartford. There was no record of her in the current archive, but Martha would find her. Somewhere, a shadow of Evelyn remained. A nurse's signature. A misplaced insurance bill. A line item in a budget ledger no one thought to erase. That was the thing about the truth, it rarely vanished. It just waited to be seen again. Later that week, Elise organized a meeting. They gathered in the converted loungeance, a place where forced activities were performed under watchful eyes, now cleared of clutter and full of people who had learned how to speak again. Survivors, family members, legal aides, even 2 local volunteers from a nearby college. The room pulsed with something real. Not rage. Not even grief. Purpose. Martha stood at the front, her notebook pressed to her chest. I know some of you never imagined coming back to this place, she began, her voice steady. But I want you to know this isn't about reliving what happened. This is about reclaiming what was taken. She looked around the room. So many worn faces, so many younger ones, carrying inherited pain. We're not just telling our stories, she continued. We're building a record they can't bury. A woman in the back raised her hand. My sister was sent here in 1992, she said, voice trembling. She was 17, pregnant. They said it was a home for troubled girls. We never saw her again. My parents got a call that she'd been transferred to a convent out west, but they never gave us the name. Martha nodded gently. Do you still have the call logs? Any letters? Receipts? The woman reached into her purse and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper. A Western Union receipt. 1 line. A destination. No contact. Martha took it like it was gold. Because it was. Every clue was a thread, and every thread could be pulled. That night, she sat in her room surrounded by papers. A sea of names, photos, scribbled notes, timelines that were beginning to overlap. She pinned a map to the wall beside her dresser. Red dots bloomed across 5 states. Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Oregon, Colorado. Places where other retreat centers had quietly operated under the same umbrella company. Same management. Same patterns. Elise walked in just as Martha marked a sixth point with attack. "I think I found our connection," she said, handing Martha a document. "A shipping company that made weekly deliveries to all of them. Same route, same driver. Even now, the paperwork runs through a shell company in New Mexico." Martha skimmed the form. "How do we prove what was inside?" "We don't," Elise said. "Not yet. But we find the driver. We talk to him. And maybe." She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Martha sat back and stared at the map again. The picture was forming. And it wasn't just about St. Bellamy's anymore. It never had been. 2 days later, Colin returned to the chapel. He moved slowly, his steps careful but sure. He wore a gray hoodie, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and the faint trace of color had returned to his cheeks. Martha walked beside him, matching his pace. "I keep thinking," he said quietly, "about how normal it all felt. For a while. The routine, the quiet, the way no one ever asked questions." Martha nodded. "That's how they built it. Not with walls, with rituals." Quote. He stopped just outside the sanctuary doors. "But they can't take back what I remember. And I do remember." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's why we write it down." At the next meeting, Martha brought a stack of envelopes, each one addressed to a different agency: state boards, medical oversight committees, civil rights organizations, and one to the Department of Justice. She passed them out, one by one. "This isn't just a story anymore," she said. "It's a movement. We've built a record, a network, a map, and now it's time to make sure someone listens." She looked around the room. "And if they don't?" She smiled. "Then we make noise." That evening, as dusk settled once more behind the pines, Martha returned to her window and opened it wide. The wind came through gently, carrying the scent of pine needles and the distant smoke of someone's evening fire. She closed her eyes. The silence that came with it wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't a warning. It was a clearing, a breath, a beginning. And she was ready. The envelope in Martha's hands felt heavier than paper should. Not because of its contents, only 3 pages, neatly typed, folded with care, but because of where it was going. On the front, in bold black ink, was the name of a senator's office in Helena, a contact Elise had secured through an old colleague from her nursing days, someone who now served on a health oversight committee. This was no longer a whisper. It was a knock at the door. Martha stood at the edge of the driveway just outside St. Bellamy's, waiting for the courier. The building behind her was still half wrapped in yellow tape, though the agents had left days ago. It no longer looked like a place of punishment, but neither had it returned to peace. Its future was uncertain. Some whispered that the grounds would be sold to a private developer, maybe razed altogether. But Martha didn't care what became of the building. Brick and paint didn't matter. It was the stories within that needed saving. And she was beginning to understand just how many there were. The courier arrived in a dusty green sedan. Young, distracted, barely looked up from his clipboard when she handed him the letter. "Got it," he muttered. "Heading north. Should be scanned by tomorrow." And then he was gone, tires kicking up gravel, tailpipe sputtering smoke. Martha stood still for a long moment, eyes fixed on the empty road. Somewhere down that stretch of highway, her voice was now riding toward a chamber filled with people who had the power to hold others accountable or to do nothing at all. She prayed they were different from the ones who had looked the other way for so long. Later that afternoon, Colin asked to return to the basement. Not alone, and not without reason. He wanted to document it. They descended the same stairwell where Martha had once held her breath and counted each creaking step. But now, with flashlights in hand and a camera borrowed from a volunteer, they moved with purpose. The rooms were still intact. The chair with the restraints, the metal cot without blankets, the shelf with neatly labeled vials, each stamped with numbers that meant nothing unless you knew how to decode them. Martha stood at the threshold while Colin moved carefully through the space, photographing every corner, pausing over each item as if trying to memorize it again. He hadn't spoken much about what had happened in this place to him. She hadn't asked, not because she didn't care, but because she understood some things only became speakable in time. He knelt by the wall near the final room and held up the flashlight. "That wasn't here before," he said. She joined him. Etched into the lower part of the concrete, faint but legible, were 4 words scratched by a sharp object. "We were still awake." Martha stared at it, heart tight. They tried to erase them, she said softly. But even sleep couldn't keep them quiet. They took photos of that too. When they returned to the main floor, the sun had dipped lower. The late light slanted through the windows in golden bars, illuminating dust motes that swirled like memory. Elise was waiting in the common room with news. "The map is growing," she said. 2 more facilities confirmed, same operating board, different names, one in Idaho, one in Colorado. She laid out the documents on the table, legal filings, tax IDs, rental agreements. "They're still open," she added, "but not for long." Quote. Colin leaned over the papers. "Do we have names?" Elise nodded. "I'm contacting journalists tomorrow, independent ones. The major outlets are still slow to bite, but the smaller ones, they're hungry." Martha smiled. "They'll listen," she said. "And if they don't, we'll give them something they can't ignore." That night, she wrote again. Not a letter this time. Not a report. But something more dangerous to the people who had built this system. A personal account. She began at the beginning her arrival, the quiet dread, the warnings carved into furniture and whispered through the walls. She wrote of Lorna and Colin and the hidden pages. She wrote of the chapel, the false prayers, the performance of safety. And she ended with a sentence that came from somewhere deeper than memory. "What they tried to take from me was not my mind, but my ability to believe I had one." She set the pen down. Then she printed 5 copies. In the days that followed, survivors began sending messages. Some came by email, some by phone, others through letters delivered by hand. One woman drove 8 hours to leave a single photo at the gate, a picture of her mother outside a different home, run by the same shadowed board. They pinned it to the wall. A mosaic began to form, not of pain, but of testimony. A visual reminder that what had been hidden was now being named. Each time a new name was added, Martha felt the weight in her chest shift, not lighter, but more balanced, like bricks in a foundation instead of on her back. By the end of the week, the senator's office responded. An official inquiry had been opened. Hearings would be scheduled, depositions collected, and they wanted Martha to testify. She didn't hesitate. "I'll go," she told Elise. And when Elise asked if she was nervous, Martha shook her head. "Not anymore," she said. "For once in my life, I'm not afraid of being the oldest voice in the room." That evening, before bed, Martha stood at the edge of the woods behind the facility. The air was cool, the stars scattered across the sky like quiet witnesses. She closed her eyes and let the wind pass through her, carrying with it every name she could remember. Lorna, Evelyn, Colin, Elise, the unnamed girl who had carved "We were still awake" into the wall. She whispered thanks to them all, then turned and walked back into the building that had once been a grave for silence and was now a place where the truth had finally found its voice. The State House in Helena rose modestly above the town, its pale dome catching morning light like a quiet promise. Martha stood at the bottom of its wide stone steps, her coat buttoned tight against the early wind, hands tucked calmly inside wool-lined pockets. Around her, everything moved faster than she liked: reporters trailing wires, aides checking notes, a security guard holding the door just long enough before urging the next person through. But she didn't move yet. She let her eyes rest on the bronze statue in the square across the street, a pioneer woman clutching a child in one hand, a lantern in the other. Carved into the base were the words, "She walked forward when others turned away." Martha smiled to herself. Fitting. Inside, the hearing chamber was smaller than she had imagined, not as grand as it appeared on television. Fluorescent lights hummed above pale wooden benches. Cameras were positioned discreetly near the corners. The panel of officials looked tired already, sifting through folders and sipping from identical paper cups. They called her name just after 11. She walked slowly to the table, unfolded her prepared statement, and adjusted the microphone. Her fingers didn't shake. "My name is Martha Clayborne," she began, her voice clear, low, unhurried. "I'm 68 years old. I was admitted to St. Bellamy's Rest in Montana last fall. I was told it was a place for healing, for peace, but what I found there was something else entirely." No one interrupted. She told them about the files, about the chapel logbooks, about Lorna and Colin, about the basement, about the pattern of removal and rewriting. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "I know what it's like to be unheard," she said near the end, "to speak softly in rooms where no one wants the truth to echo. But I also know that silence is not neutrality. It's complicity. And I'm done being complicit. Cry. When she finished, there was no applause. Just silence. Heavy. And full. Then a senator leaned forward and asked, quietly, "Mrs. Clayborne, do you believe this is still happening?" She looked him in the eye. "I believe it never stopped." That night, back in the guest house where the state had arranged for her to stay, she sat by the window and replayed the hearing in her mind. Not the questions or even her answers, but the faces. Some grim, some disbelieving, a few broken open just enough for something honest to slip through. She didn't know if it would change policy, but she knew someone had felt it. That was a start. Elise called just after dinner. "They're moving faster now," she said. "The Department of Health issued a statement this afternoon. They're opening investigations into 5 other facilities." "Good," Martha said. "They should. They've also requested more documents, specifically your list, the registry." Martha stood and moved to the bookshelf where she kept it, a binder thick with names, stories, bits of memory rescued from institutional dust. "I'll send it tomorrow." Elise hesitated. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Martha smiled faintly. "Number." But I wasn't ready for what came before either. And I survived that. The next morning, she mailed the registry with a short note on top. "This is not a complete list." Because the silence was too complete. "But it's a beginning. Do not let it be the end." 2 days later, the first article appeared. Not in the national papers. Not yet. But on a local blog maintained by a university journalism student who had followed Martha's hearing. The headline was simple: "The Woman Who Named the Quiet." It was shared more than she expected. Then came emails. Dozens at first. Then hundreds. A nurse from a closed facility in Colorado sent a scanned photograph of intake logs. A daughter from Oregon forwarded a voicemail her mother had left years ago, fragmented, terrified, begging to come home. A man in Arizona wrote only one sentence: "I was one of them too. Thank you." Martha read each message carefully. Some made her cry. Others made her close the laptop and sit with the ache in her chest, letting it expand before it passed. But none of them made her regret. She started writing again. Not just letters, not just timelines, but a book. Elise suggested it first. "If they won't archive the truth, we will." And so, in a quiet room filled with soft light and pine-dusted air, Martha began the story again. From the beginning. In her words. In her voice. This time no one could take it from her. Outside, spring was pressing at the windows. The snow was nearly gone. Buds had begun forming on the trees, brave and stubborn. Martha paused, pen in hand, and watched a bird land on the feeder just outside her window. She thought of Lorna then, of the carved message in the basement wall: "We were still awake." She nodded, almost to herself. "And now, we are wide open." She turned back to the page and kept writing. The first chapter of the book was published as a standalone article in a regional magazine known for quiet, slow-burning pieces, the kind of stories that didn't chase attention but earned it. Martha hadn't planned it that way, but the editor, a former student of Elise's friend, had asked gently. Just the opening. Just enough to begin the conversation. She agreed, thinking it might ripple softly across a few hearts. It surged. Within days, the magazine's website crashed under the weight of unexpected traffic. People began to quote lines from her story online. Teachers printed copies for class discussions. Book clubs requested permission to read it aloud. A podcast host invited her to speak. Martha declined most of the interviews. She never wanted the spotlight just for someone, anyone, to keep reading. But when a young woman named Clara knocked on the door of the Hope Registry office with trembling hands and a weathered photograph, Martha knew it was time to open the next chapter. Clara had no voice tremble when she began. She had practiced this too many times. Her grandmother, Alice, had spent 3 years in a religious care facility in Utah. The facility no longer existed. It had burned in a mysterious electrical fire during renovations 15 years ago. No records survived. No press covered it. But Clara had one thing they didn't: a journal. Her grandmother had written in secret for 2 of those years, notes hidden in the margins of old hymnals. Clara had found them folded into a shoebox buried beneath layers of clothes in the attic. She was 16 when she discovered them. Now she was 28, and she wanted them to matter. Martha and Elise spent hours reading each page. The language was sparse but powerful. Alice hadn't written for drama. She'd written to stay sane. Descriptions of isolation, of being called ungrateful for asking about her mail, of another woman who cried out in her sleep and was moved somewhere no one could find. Then came a line that chilled Martha more than she expected. They think no one will come looking for women like us, that our words will dissolve like sugar in tea. Martha closed the notebook slowly. Send copies to the oversight board, she told Elise, and one to the Attorney General's office. Quote. Clara nodded. Do you think anyone will care? Martha reached for the photograph Clara had brought. It showed Alice, standing outside a brick building with ivy-covered windows, arms around two other women. They looked tired, but they smiled. They will now, she said. The next morning, Martha stood in front of a group of college students at a community forum. She hadn't intended to speak, but the organizers had begged gently just a few words to open the event. She looked out at their faces, all young, all expectant. When I was your age, she began, I believed bad things happened far away in shadowed places done by monstrous people. I believed that kindness always won, and that speaking up was enough. She paused. I was wrong about some of that. But not all. The people who built the systems we're dismantling now didn't look like monsters. They looked like caretakers. Like leaders. Like the kind of people your parents told you to trust. Quote. A few heads nodded. But speaking up, she continued, that still matters. And when one voice isn't enough, we lift it higher together. She left the stage to quiet applause, the kind that meant someone had actually heard. That night, she sat by Colin's desk, watching him scroll through another list of names. We've got 27 potential sites now, he said, turning the laptop toward her. Some are confirmed. Some we're still verifying. Most are still operating. Again. She traced her finger down the list. One stood out. Harmony Glen, Nebraska. She didn't know why the name pulled at her, but something in it felt wrong. Too gentle, too staged. Let's start there, she said. Find out who's funding it. Who's listed on the board. Colin nodded, already typing. Outside, a storm had begun. The wind pushed against the window pane like it was trying to get in and be heard. Martha turned to the noise, then smiled faintly. Let it come. Later that week, a delivery arrived at the registry, a box with no return label, addressed simply to the woman who named the quiet. Inside were photographs. Dozens. Some old and yellowing, others more recent. Every image showed a different building. Unmarked homes in small towns. Facilities tucked behind churches. Retreat centers on rural roads. Most were labeled in pen. Montana 1,983. New Mexico 1,990. Idaho 1,975. One envelope was sealed separately, and inside was a letter written in cursive. Martha. I worked there once. I was young, naive. I thought I was helping, until they told me not to ask questions, until they moved a girl I cared about and said she was better off. I left that year, but I carried it with me. I'm sorry I was silent. Here is what I remember. Please do what I couldn't. No names signed. Just a former nurse. Martha held the envelope for a long time. Then she added the photos to the archive, labeled the envelope, and filed it under witness submissions. She didn't cry, but her breath caught in her throat as she closed the cabinet. Because for the first time since this all began, she understood something she hadn't dared believe. They were coming back. Not just the victims, but the bystanders. The enablers. The ones who had turned away and were now finally turning around. And in that turning, the wheel of silence began to slow. Not stop. Not yet. But slow. And maybe, just maybe, that was how the world began to heal. Snow returned earlier than expected. By late October, the trees around the Hope Registry were rimmed in white, their branches heavy, like they too were tired from carrying the past. Martha stood at the kitchen window with a mug in her hands, watching the flakes drift without urgency. It reminded her of childhood winters, back when snow had meant wonder instead of warning. Now it seemed to signal something else, that the world was still turning despite everything they had uncovered. That morning, she received a call from a radio station in Minneapolis. They wanted her to be a guest on their morning segment, Voices That Matter. She declined gently, as always, but offered to send excerpts from the registry and suggest someone younger, maybe one of the volunteers who had joined the cause after reading her piece online. She didn't need to be the voice anymore. The echo was loud enough now without her at the center. After lunch, she joined Colin in the converted office space. It used to be the game room when St. Bellamy's was still operating, a space filled with puzzles no one touched and coloring books left half-finished. Now, it buzzed with purpose. Desks lined the walls. Whiteboards bore maps with dotted red lines, and clipboards stacked with testimony lay waiting to be entered into the growing digital archive. Colin looked up from the screen as she entered. His posture had straightened over the months. He carried himself differently now, less like a survivor and more like a builder. "There's been movement on Harmony Glen," he said, gesturing to the laptop. Martha pulled up a chair beside him. "Tell me." "New documents surfaced this morning," he said. Elise got them from a contact inside a county clerk's office in Nebraska. Financial filings. Turns out, the parent company that owns Harmony Glen also managed at least 4 other properties that were quietly shut down over the last decade. Same board, 3 names overlap. But here's the kicker: they moved the operational address twice this year. Once to Texas, then again last month to a law firm in Delaware. She shook her head. "They're scrubbing their trail." "Trying," he said. "But not fast enough." She leaned closer, scanning the forms. One stood out, a shipment invoice from 6 years prior, listing medical supplies, specialty furniture, and therapeutic restraints. "They never thought anyone would read this," she murmured. "Or that we'd know what we were reading." Martha nodded slowly, then reached for her notebook. "Let's cross-reference. Maybe we can match these dates with the missing persons list from that region. Check for patterns: intake dates, unexplained transfers, sudden medical discharges." Quote. Colin was already typing. Outside the window, snow continued to fall, quiet but persistent. It covered everything, even as the engine of their investigation turned louder, faster, more undeniable. Later that afternoon, they were joined by a woman named Nora. She was in her mid-50s, soft-spoken, with silver threads woven through her dark hair. She carried a single envelope, worn at the edges. "My brother," she said quietly. "His name was Calvin. He was 24 when he went into a facility in Utah. That was in 1998. We were told he had episodes, that he needed stabilization. We didn't hear from him after that." She laid the envelope on the table. Inside were 2 letters handwritten by Calvin before his disappearance. They weren't long, just notes. One was a thank you to Nora for a birthday card. The other included a sketch of the mountain behind the facility. But on the bottom of the second letter, in faint pencil, were the words, "They don't call it punishment, but it feels like forgetting." Martha read the line twice. Then she looked at Nora. "You kept these all this time?" Nora nodded. "I didn't know what else to do, but now I do." They scanned the letters and entered Calvin's name into the registry. By evening, another volunteer had matched the mountain in the sketch to a location near a decommissioned religious retreat in northern Utah, now owned by a holding company with ties to the same legal group behind Harmony Glen. It was another thread, and Martha knew exactly what to do with it. That night, she wrote again. Not a letter, not a book page, a speech. She had agreed, finally, to one public appearance. It was Elise who had asked, her tone softer than usual. "There's a conference next month," she said. "National Association for Institutional Accountability. They've invited us to present the registry. They want someone to explain how it began." Martha had sighed, already shaking her head. But Elise leaned in. "It's time." So she wrote. Not with the urgency of someone trying to be heard, but with the weight of someone who had been. She wrote about Lorna, about the chapel, about Colin's recovery, about the nurses who turned in keys and quietly left notes under her door. She ended with a simple truth. They built their power on our silence. We are building ours on each other. When she finished, she sat still for a long time. Not because she doubted the words, but because she knew they would reach people who hadn't yet allowed themselves to believe. People like the younger version of herself. People who one day might find themselves standing at the edge of some quiet place, wondering if what they feel in their chest is fear or instinct. She hoped, when that moment came, they would remember this story. and choose to ask the next question, even if their voice trembled. Especially then. Martha arrived in Chicago 2 days before the conference. The train had rocked gently through the plains and cornfields of Nebraska, giving her time to collect her thoughts. She preferred trains to airplanes. There was something honest about the slowness, about seeing the land pass by, mile after mile, rather than vanishing above the clouds. It allowed space for remembering. She carried only one small suitcase and a soft leather bag filled with documents, testimonies, reports, letters, and the first complete print edition of the Hope Registry. The pages were bound by hand with a simple blue cover and no title on the front, just an embossed number in the bottom corner. Volume 1. The hotel room was comfortable, but impersonal gray walls, neatly folded towels, the faint hum of recycled air. She unpacked slowly, lining her materials on the desk like an altar. A photograph of Lorna rested between 2 paperweights. Martha didn't travel with much, but that image never left her side. On the first night, she joined a private pre-conference gathering, a circle of survivors, advocates, attorneys, and journalists. Some she had known only by email. Others had followed her story since the first article. They greeted her with quiet nods, a few handshakes, and one unexpected embrace from a woman who whispered, "You saved my sister. You didn't know it, but you did." Martha didn't ask for details. She simply said, "Thank you for telling me," and sat down near the edge of the room. The conversation swirled around her. People shared updates, legislative efforts underway, recent closures of questionable facilities. Elise arrived midway through, flanked by 2 new volunteers, both under 30, both already running satellite chapters of the registry in their own cities. Martha watched them speak with fluency and fire. She smiled, not from pride, but from something deeper, recognition. The future had arrived, and it spoke in new voices, carried in hands that had not yet known surrender. The morning of her presentation, snow dusted the city sidewalks, not heavy, just enough to soften the corners of the buildings. The auditorium was already filling when she arrived, clutching her notes and a fresh copy of the registry. She wore a navy blue dress with a pin at her Clara silver branch, a gift from Clara, whose grandmother's journal had become one of the most cited pieces of testimony in recent months. When they called her name, the room quieted. She took the stage slowly, letting her eyes adjust to the lights, her fingers smoothing the pages once, then again. She did not read from the script. She folded it in half and laid it gently on the podium. "I'm not here today because I'm brave," she began, her voice calm even. "I'm here because someone else was, and I listened." She told the room about the first night at St. Bellamy's, about the moment she realized the silence was too practiced, about the chapel, the journal, the basement. She described Colin without naming him, his recovery, his strength, how he had begun to code the database that now held over 400 names. She spoke of patterns, of laws that existed but weren't enforced, of reports that were filed but never read. Then she paused. "For a long time I thought we were fighting a system," she said, "and we are. But beneath that we are also fighting something harder to name, a belief that some voices matter less, that when the vulnerable are hurt, it's unfortunate, but not urgent." She let the silence sit. "I came here to say it is urgent, and to ask you not to turn away, because this isn't about one facility or one story, it's about all of us, about what kind of care we accept, and what kind of cruelty we allow to wear the costume of care." When she stepped down, they stood for her, not all at once, but slowly, meaningfully, and she felt it not applause but acknowledgement. She wasn't just being heard, she was being believed. Later she sat alone in a small cafe near the hotel, nursing a cup of tea. The conference was still going, but she needed space to breathe. Her shoulders ached in that quiet way they did, after carrying too much weight. A woman approached the table. She looked younger than Martha, but not by much. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out a chair without asking and sat across from her. "I wasn't going to say anything," she said, eyes wide, "but I have to." Martha nodded once. She didn't speak. "I worked for them," the woman whispered. "Not at Bellamy's. At a place in Oregon. For 3 years. I saw things. I told myself I didn't. I signed papers I didn't read. I filed records with names blacked out. I never said anything." Martha set down her cup. "But I remember. And if you still want names, I have them." She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded list. Martha unfolded it carefully. 15 names. 4 facilities. 3 states. And at the bottom, a simple signature. Margot. Martha looked up. The woman was crying quietly. "Am I too late?" she asked. Martha reached across the table and took her hand. "No," she said. "You're just in time." That evening in her hotel room, she placed Margot's list into a new folder marked Leads, Tier 1. She updated the digital archive with each location. Then she lit a small candle on the windowsill, not for memory, but for resolve. Not to mourn, but to guide. The city lights blinked below like tiny stars, and as Martha looked out across the skyline, she understood something clearly. Justice wasn't an event. It was a path. And tonight, more than ever, she knew she would keep walking it, even if the world tried to forget, especially then. When Martha returned home from the conference, the registry office had changed again. Not in structure, it was still the same set of converted rooms and mismatched chairs, but in feeling. The walls seemed taller somehow, the light more purposeful. The silence, once heavy with memory, now hummed with movement. There were new volunteers, younger ones. 2 women in their 20s inputting records at the far desk. A man named Diego who managed outreach to victims' families. There was even a retired librarian cataloging testimonies by theme and region. Elise had turned the quiet engine they built into something alive. It wasn't just an archive anymore. It was a movement with its own momentum. Martha walked through the main hall slowly, greeting people as she passed. Some knew her by name. Others only looked at her with a quiet nod of respect, as though she were a page out of a story they had only just begun to read. At her desk, Colin had left a sticky note on her keyboard. "Welcome back. Something came in this morning. I left it for you in the blue folder. You'll want to see it." She found the folder under her chair, right where he said it would be. Inside were scanned copies of documents from a former janitor at Harmony Glen, receipts, inventory lists. A rough map of the basement level. Most were dated between 2009 and 2012, but one was labeled more recently, July 2021. Martha sat up straighter. The page detailed the delivery of 2 unmarked crates to a side entrance on a Sunday afternoon when visitors were not allowed and most residents were in chapel. No return address. No signature. Just a notation at the bottom. Special intake, keep lights off. She stared at the phrase, trying to imagine how many times that instruction had passed across hands without raising suspicion, or worse, how often it had. Colin entered moments later, jacket half-zipped, cheeks flushed from the cold. "I thought you'd be here," he said. "There's more coming. We got a call from someone in Des Moines claims to have video footage of transports being rerouted at night. Anonymous? Wants to remain that way, for now, but they're sending the drive." Martha nodded, fingers tracing the edges of the file. For every facility exposed, another surfaced, like lifting one floor tile only to find the same mold spreading beneath them all. But this time, she didn't feel overwhelmed. She felt ready. She stood and walked with Colin to the back room, where a map covered the far wall. Colored pins dotted 5 states. Some marked verified testimonies, others active investigations. A few had yet to be confirmed, threads waiting to be pulled. "I want to send an update to the senator," she said. "She needs to see this." Colin nodded. "I'll compile it by end of day. Are we still including the nurse's statement from Margot?" "Yes, but don't just bury it in the appendix. Put it right up front. Go." He smiled. Understood. Martha turned back to the wall, eyes lingering on a pin in northern Nevada. A new facility. Shiny. Recently licensed. But owned by a name she'd seen before. "Elise is headed out there next week," Colin said, following her gaze. "She's got a contact inside. She shouldn't go alone." "She won't." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "You know, I was thinking about something Margot said in her letter, about the difference between forgetting and pretending." Quote. Martha turned toward him. She wrote, "I didn't forget what I saw. I just learned how to act like I hadn't." Martha exhaled slowly. "That's the most dangerous kind of silence. The kind people teach themselves to survive." Colin crossed his arms. "But now we're teaching them something else." "Exactly." She reached into her bag and pulled out a copy of her Chicago speech, placing it on the table. Let's post it on the site, word for word. Quote, even the part about the branch pin? She smiled. Especially that. That evening, she visited Lorna's tree. It stood near the back of the grounds, beyond the garden where residents once grew herbs and wilted daisies. After the registry took over, they planted a single sugar maple in Lorna's memory, with a flat stone at its base and one word engraved into it: witness. The branches had stretched taller than Martha remembered. Golden leaves clung to the limbs, resisting the early cold. She knelt and brushed away the new layer of snow on the stone. I thought of you in Chicago, she said softly. You would have hated the lights. But the people? You'd have liked them. They listened. A breeze passed through the branches, scattering a few leaves to the ground like a quiet applause. Martha stood, brushing her coat clean. As she walked back to the building, she saw Elise through the office window, on the phone, pacing. Colin was hunched over his desk, typing. A volunteer stood by the printer, pulling a stack of papers with her elbow as she balanced a phone between her cheek and shoulder. Each movement, each voice, was a signal that the silence they had inherited was being rewritten, not into noise, but into truth. And truth, she had learned, didn't have to be loud. It only had to last. The morning began with a knock. Not the firm, official kind that brought news or urgency, but a gentle tap-tap, hesitant, as though the hand behind it wasn't sure if it belonged. Martha rose from her desk, smoothing her cardigan, and opened the door to find a boy no older than 16 standing in the hallway. His backpack hung low on one shoulder, and he held a thin manila envelope pressed flat against his chest. He didn't speak right away, just looked up at her with dark eyes that were too cautious for his age. You're Mrs. Clayborne? He asked finally. I am. He held out the envelope. My dad asked me to bring this. He couldn't come himself. He used to work at a place called North Creek Haven. Said you'd know what it means. Martha took the envelope with both hands. What's your name? Jamie. Would you like to come in, Jamie? He hesitated, then shook his head. I have school. But he said thank you for listening. And just like that, he turned and walked back down the hallway, disappearing past the elevator, his footsteps soft and swift. She closed the door slowly and returned to her desk, laying the envelope flat on the blotter. The name North Creek Haven had been mentioned once, buried in a footnote on an old patient record from 1986. The facility had shut down decades ago after a fire, but there were whispers that it had been reopened under a new name 2 towns over. Inside the envelope were photocopies, logs, medication lists, a photograph of a wall with peeling paint where someone had scrawled in marker, "Don't let them take your words." There was also a short letter, unsigned. I was just a janitor. I never had the right degree, never sat in meetings, but I saw things, quiet things, doors that stayed locked too long. Lights left on at night in rooms that were supposed to be empty. I didn't say anything. Not then, but I'm saying it now. Martha folded the letter and placed it in the archive's growing section labeled Testimonies, Former Staff. Later that day, she and Colin reviewed the new documents. The logs confirmed something they had long suspected but hadn't yet been able to prove. North Creek Haven had received residents from out of state, bypassing normal intake procedures through a secondary transport system not listed in any official records. They called it the gray route, Colin said, pointing to a term scribbled in the margin of one sheet. Undocumented transfers, Martha replied. They moved people like freight. Elise joined them a few minutes later, her face pale from the wind outside. You need to see this, she said, holding out her phone. It was a video, posted anonymously to a message board the registry team monitored. The footage showed a van pulling up behind a facility in Colorado. No markings. 2 people in plain clothes helped an elderly woman out. She didn't resist, but her face was blank, not confused, wiped clean. They're still doing it, Elise whispered. This week. Martha leaned forward. We need to find her. I'm already tracing the plates, Colin said. Might take a few days. Martha sat back in her chair, the familiar burn lit behind her ribs. Not rage, not fear, purpose. We can't just chase, she said. We need to get ahead of them. Quote, you mean, predict the next one? She nodded slowly. If we map the funding, the ownership, the registered transport companies, they're not as invisible as they think. It's a pattern. and patterns can be broken. That evening, she stayed late in the office, lights low, a blanket draped over her shoulders. She returned to the map, studied the pins, drew faint pencil lines connecting them by year, by board member, by funding cycle. And there it was. A rhythm. Every 18 months, a new facility opened, each one within 50 miles of a defunct or scandal-closed care center, same shell companies, same vendors, a rotation meant to stay ahead of detection. Martha circled the next likely zone, Missouri, a stretch of farmland just outside Columbia. One parcel had recently been bought by an LLC named Tranquil Pines Rehabilitation. No website. No listed services. She circled it twice. The next morning, she handed the data to Elise. "Send this to the senator's office," she said, "and the attorney general. Let them know we're watching. If they don't act, we will." Elise looked down at the folder. "And what if they tell us it's not enough? Then we find more." That afternoon, another package arrived. Inside was a single audio cassette. Taped to it was a note. From the archives of Green Hollow Home, hidden behind the boiler room, date unknown. They found an old recorder in the back room. Martha pressed play. A woman's voice crackled through the static, low and steady. "If you're hearing this," she said, "it means they didn't find it. It means someone kept looking. My name is Rita. I was a nurse here from 1979 to 1984. They told us we were helping, that the patients were better off without their families, that we were protecting them, but we weren't. And I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Silence. Then, quietly, they made us believe silence was kindness. But now I know it was just control. Quote. The tape clicked at the end. Martha sat still for a long time, then rewound it and played it again. Because voices like that deserve to be heard. And remembered. Forever. The tape stayed with her. Long after the click at the end, after the grainy hum of Rita's voice faded, Martha found herself hearing it in the quiet between tasks. Those words, "they made us believe silence was kindness," ran like a current beneath her day. It wasn't the confession that struck her most, but the clarity of it. Not frantic, not apologetic, just the truth, given plainly by a woman who had nothing left to lose. That night, Martha transcribed every word, by hand. She copied the tape into the registry archive, labeled it Audio Testimony 001, verified, and made sure it would never be lost again. But something in her shifted. They were no longer just uncovering stories. They were building a record the world would have to reckon with. By the following week, Colin had finished mapping out the financial trail to Tranquil Pines Rehabilitation. It wasn't difficult, at least not anymore. The same patterns emerged. A front company registered in Wyoming, a board with overlapping names, a history of rapid land acquisition near medically underserved areas. They planned to open in 2 months, he said, tapping the file with a pencil. They've already started construction. Martha leaned over the table, eyes narrowed. Do we have someone nearby? Not yet. Elise has a contact in Jefferson City. She's reaching out. Let's move faster, Martha said. I'm not waiting for them to hurt someone before we step in. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in over a year. A journalist named Hal Beckerance, a firebrand in his prime, now semi-retired but still sharp. He had covered the early days of the registry, then moved on when the public's attention waned. When he answered, his voice was slower than she remembered, but not dull. Martha Clayborne, didn't expect to hear from you. I wouldn't call if it weren't urgent. Quote, that's the only kind of call you make. She told him everything. The Missouri facility, the ownership trail, the pattern, the audio tape, the boy named Jamie. There was a pause on the line. Then Hal said, give me 48 hours. 2 days later, his story broke. Not buried in the back section, but front page of a major digital outlet. The headline was clean and cold. They called it CARE, a hidden network of silence and control. Within hours, the article was shared by advocacy groups, disability rights organizations, medical watchdog accounts. The hashtag number "they called it CARE" trended on social media. More names began to surface. More stories. Even more quietly, whistleblowers reached out to the registry inbox. One message stood out. It was from a woman in St. Louis. She worked for a construction firm hired to build a therapeutic intake annex on the Tranquil Pines property. She described rooms with no windows, narrow door frames, hooks embedded into the concrete. She hadn't said anything before because she thought it was standard. But then I read the article. Her message read, "And I realize it's not right. I still have the blueprints. Do you want them?" Martha replied within minutes. When the plans arrived the next morning, she and Colin laid them out across the long table in the registry's main room. Room 3C had no marked ventilation. Room 3D had 2 exit zones labeled internal use only. And the hallway between 2A and 2C was deliberately designed to avoid direct camera angles. "This isn't healthcare," Colin said quietly. "It's containment," Martha replied. That same afternoon, Elise called with news. The state's Department of Public Health had issued a preliminary hold on Tranquil Pines' license, pending investigation. It wasn't permanent, not yet, but it was enough to stop construction, enough to delay. It bought them time. But more than that, it sent a message. They weren't just reacting anymore. They were intervening. That evening, Martha sat by herself in the records room. The walls were lined with boxes, chronological, color-coded, all meticulously filed. She reached for the latest volume of the registry and opened to the back section, where they had begun documenting not just testimonies but victories. There, between pages filled with transcripts and images, was a photo someone had taken that morning. A bulldozer paused in front of Tranquil Pines, construction halted, the gate padlocked. It wasn't a dramatic image. No one stood holding signs. No news crew waited nearby, but to her it was monumental. She slipped the photo into a plastic sleeve and added a caption beneath. The first facility stopped before it opened. Her hand trembled slightly as she sealed the page. Then she stood and walked slowly to the front of the building. Outside, it had started to snow again. Not the light, ornamental kind. This was heavier, thick flakes that fell with quiet purpose, the kind that blanketed the earth, that made everything pause. She stepped into the cold without her coat, just for a moment. Let the wind brush across her cheeks. Let herself feel it. The world was still turning, but this time they were steering, even if only slightly, even if only for now. From across the parking lot, Colin appeared, his shoulders hunched, hands in his pockets. He gave her a half smile as he approached. "You okay?" he asked. "I am," she said. "More than I've been in years." They stood together under the snowfall, silent, not because there was nothing left to say, but because, for once, the silence was theirs. The cold lingered longer than expected. By early November, the wind had stiffened, and frost crept across the edges of the registry's windows each morning. It was the kind of weather that discouraged motion, but the office never slowed. If anything, the pace quickened. With Tranquil Pines halted, and Hal Becker's article still echoing across national platforms, the wave had not receded, it had deepened. More stories arrived, some from family members who had finally connected long-dormant memories to what they'd read, others from staff maintenance workers, food service employees, record keepers who had always felt something was wrong but hadn't known where to turn. And in that steady stream of testimony, one name kept surfacing: Marigold Haven. The first time Martha saw it was in a file from Utah. Then again in a letter from a woman in Kentucky who claimed her aunt had been transferred there after a disciplinary incident. Finally, a nurse practitioner from Idaho sent a scanned forma discharge summary with the name typed clearly at the top: Facility, Marigold Haven Wellness Center. Location, undisclosed. Status, restricted. Martha circled the name in red ink. Something about it rang false. The name was too soft, too curated. She knew by now the patterns of these shadow facilities, how they dressed cruelty and compassion, how they used words like wellness and retreat to mask isolation and silence. She spent that afternoon in the archives, combing through old press releases, public health bulletins, even outdated licensing records. Nothing, no mention, no trace. That meant it wasn't licensed. Or worse, it never had to be. She printed every document that referenced Marigold Haven and laid them out across the conference table. Elise joined her, rubbing her temples from a long phone call with legal partners in Oregon. "Another ghost house?" Elise asked, scanning the papers. Martha nodded. "But not like the others. This one doesn't want to be seen at all. No incorporation records, no tax ID, just referrals. Word-of-mouth transfers from facilities already under scrutiny. An unofficial destination, Elise said. No trail. Only whispers. By the time Colin arrived, the table was full. He studied the evidence for a long moment, then looked up. We might not find it with paperwork. What do you suggest? Martha asked. He tapped the map pinned to the far wall. We follow the bodies. Silence fell. But he wasn't wrong. We reference every missing person connected to those source facilities, he continued. Look for clusters, travel patterns, families who stopped hearing updates after a certain date. It was grim work, but necessary. For the next 4 days, the registry team poured through spreadsheets, scanned call logs, re-interviewed family members. They built a new file titled MH, Unconfirmed Sites. It included 5 possible states, 3 probable regions, 1 high-likelihood zone, southern New Mexico, near the edge of a desert town called Clay Hills. No internet listing. No property in the name of Marigold Haven, but a church-owned parcel, bought in 2007, that had been zoned as special use facility and surrounded by a 12-foot privacy fence. A volunteer named Dana had family nearby. She offered to drive out and report back. She left on a Thursday morning under gray skies and didn't return until late Friday night. Her face was pale when she stepped into the registry's main room, coat still dusted with road salt. I found it, she said. No one spoke. It's quiet. Too quiet. No signage. The driveway is gravel. Only one entrance. I parked a mile away and hiked in with binoculars. Martha sat down across from her. What did you see? 3 buildings, all identical, all windowless on 3 sides. People in white uniforms moving slowly, never alone. I saw a man maybe 70 being walked around a courtyard. His hands were bound together like they didn't trust him to be still. Elise's jaw clenched. Did you take pictures? Dana pulled out a small camera, placed it on the table and nodded. Not great quality, but enough. They uploaded the photos immediately. In one, the profile of the man was partially visible. Thin frame, hollow expression, no clear injuries, but the posture screamed of resignation. Martha stared at the image, her chest tightening. This was what they had tried to prevent. And yet here it was. I want to go, she said quietly. Elise turned. Absolutely not. Quote, I won't go alone. I'll stay on public roads, but I need to see it. Colin added, you can't get close, not without them noticing. I don't need to get close, Martha replied. I just need to be present, to let myself feel the truth of that place. It's how I know what to do next. The next morning, she and Colin drove out before dawn. The desert was vast and unwelcoming. The sky stretched flat across the horizon, colored in streaks of bone white and muted blue. The GPS ended 6 miles before the site, so they followed Dana's hand-drawn map, weaving down cracked county roads lined with barbed wire and rusted gates. They parked at a ridge, far enough to avoid being seen. From there, the facility came into view. Just as Dana had described, 3 long, narrow buildings, pale beige against the sand. No sign, no movement, except for a lone golf cart trailing slowly between the structures. It didn't look like a healthcare center. It looked like a storage site. Like someone had built a place to tuck people away and forget them. Martha didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, This is the last one. Colin frowned. The last what? The last time we wait. She pulled out her phone and took 3 photos. We take this public. Now. Before they can vanish it like the others. Colin nodded slowly. Do you think people will care? Martha stared out across the sand. They will, she said, because this time, we show them the whole picture. As they drove back toward the highway, dust trailing behind them like a signal, Martha glanced in the rearview mirror. The facility shrank in the distance, but its shadow reached far. And this time, it would be named. The air in the office was tense the next morning. Not panic. No one was panicking anymore, but electric, like something just beneath the surface was beginning to shift. Martha could feel it as soon as she stepped through the door. The volunteers spoke in lower voices. Colin was already at his desk, his fingers moving quickly over the keyboard, pulling news wires, flagging alerts. They're trying to get ahead of it, he said without turning around. The owners of the Marigold Haven site just released a statement. It's vague, but they're claiming it's a long-term rehabilitation center for individuals with advanced dementia. Privately funded, not open to the public. Martha set her coat on the rack. No mention of the residents themselves. Not one, not a name, not a family. Just services and privacy. Elise entered next, her phone still pressed to her ear, her expression drawn tight. They've retained counsel. Same firm used in the Bellamy case. They're expecting trouble. They should, Martha said evenly. The photos Dana had taken had already been sent to half a dozen journalists. 3 outlets had responded with interest. 1, a podcast collective known for their deep investigative reporting, had committed to a multi-part series. The first episode would air within the week. The team decided to push ahead with their own release. They spent the next 24 hours compiling everything they had: maps, financial records, personal accounts, and most damning of all, the architectural plans that confirmed Marigold Haven's internal structure had been designed for containment, not care. Martha wrote the introduction herself. Not dramatic, just honest. This is not speculation. This is not theory. This is evidence of a continuing system of concealed institutional abuse housed in buildings that masquerade as healthcare, operated by organizations that thrive in the dark, and protected by the quiet of bureaucracy. The document was published at noon the following day. By dusk, it had been downloaded over 60,000 times. The messages poured in. Some from reporters, some from former employees, some from people who had driven past the building in Clay Hills and wondered why it had no signage, no visitors, no deliveries in daylight. And then one from a woman named Therese. She'd found the document through her daughter, who had forwarded it after seeing the name Marigold Haven. Therese's sister, Marianne, had been placed in a facility by that name 3 years ago. Since then, contact had been limited to a monthly form letter-typed, unsigned, with brief health updates. No phone calls. No visits allowed due to safety protocols. Therese had accepted it, believed it, until now. Now she was furious. I want her out, the email read. Tell me how. Martha sat back in her chair, staring at the words. This was new. This wasn't just about exposing anymore. It was about extraction. We're going to need lawyers, she said aloud. Elise looked up from her laptop. We already have 2. I'll call them tonight. Quote, by the next morning, they'd connected Therese with a legal team willing to file an emergency petition. The challenge would be jurisdiction. Marianne had been transferred across state lines, and her guardianship status had been modified without family consultation. Colin reviewed the digital record. Looks like they marked her as medically incapacitated after a single evaluation, done by someone tied to the facility. No external review. That's how they keep them, Martha said. Create the conditions, then cite them. Over the following week, the story grew. Hal Becker published a second article, this time focused solely on Marigold Haven. He included the floor plans, Dana's photos, testimonies, the audio clip of Rita's confession. The article ended with a photo of the ridge where Martha had stood. No faces, just the barren stretch of land, and beneath it the caption, "What the world does not see still exists." Public pressure surged. An online petition calling for a full investigation passed 100,000 signatures in 3 days. News crews showed up in Clay Hills. One brave journalist parked her van near the property for 2 nights, filming changes in staff behavior. On the 3rd night, the gates were locked with chains, curtains were drawn, no lights turned on until dawn, and then, quietly, the facility deactivated its website. Phone numbers went dead. The registry team expected a stall, but what came was something else entirely. A knock at the office door. A man stood there. Mid-40s. Corduroy jacket, clean cut, eyes rimmed with worry. I think my mother is in there, he said, not even waiting to be invited in. But I don't know for sure. She went missing 6 months ago after being discharged from another facility. She has no history of violence, no dementia, nothing. But she was listed as requiring special housing. That's all they would tell me. Coat. Martha led him to the table, asked for her name. He gave it. Eleanor Pierce. It wasn't in the registry. Yet. But Elise checked the database. Her file existed, under a different name. EP number 447, restricted transfer. She had been sent from a California wellness center shut down in 2020, then routed through a temporary site in Nevada before landing in New Mexico. They'd changed her identity by abbreviation. A clerical trick. Martha exhaled sharply. We'll get her back, Guo. It was the first time she'd said those words out loud, and meant every syllable. They weren't just chronicling anymore. They were intervening. They were saving people, one name at a time. They met her at the border. Eleanor Pierce. It was a Thursday evening, just past dusk, when the white government van pulled to the side of the highway near the Arizona-New Mexico line. The air was dry, brittle, and the sun had already dropped behind the hills, casting everything in soft amber shadow. A state caseworker stepped out first, followed by a nurse and then, finally, a slender woman with silver-threaded hair and a wool coat too heavy for the desert air. Martha was already there. She stood a few yards away, her coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders, waiting. She recognized the posture even before she saw the face, the slight forward lean, the cautious eyes, the way the woman seemed unsure whether she was stepping into safety or into another trick of silence. "Eleanor," Martha said gently. The woman paused, then nodded. They didn't embrace. There was no grand moment, no tears. Just the shared gaze of two people who had known too much silence and had lived to name it. "You're safe now," Martha said. "We know who you are, and we're not letting them erase you." Eleanor looked down at her hands, fingers twitching slightly, then raised her head with the quiet dignity of someone reclaiming ground that had once been stolen. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse. "I wasn't sure I was still real." Martha's throat tightened, but she only replied, "You are, and you're not alone anymore." They helped Eleanor into the car and began the long drive back to the registry's temporary safe residence in Tucson. Elise had arranged it through a network of social workers who now worked closely with the registry, offering short-term shelter and psychological care for rescued residents. What had begun as a file room in Montana had become a lifeline stretching across states, wrapping around the country like a quiet web of resistance. When they arrived, the porch light was already on. A small one-story house with lavender bushes near the fence, a kitchen stocked with soup and bread, a therapist on call for the night. Eleanor sat at the table, hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, and spoke only 3 sentences before she fell asleep in the guest room. "I don't remember the date they took me. They changed my name to make the paperwork cleaner. They said I was better off if no one looked." Quote. Martha stood outside the door for a long time after she'd gone to sleep, the hallway light casting a gentle glow over the floorboards. Then she turned and walked quietly out onto the porch. Elise joined her moments later. "She's the first," Elise said softly. "Of the Marigold residents." Martha nodded. "But not the last." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the stars stretch over the desert sky, clear and endless. Then Elise asked, "Do you think they'll come after us, try to stop what we're doing?" Martha exhaled slowly. "They've already tried. With silence, with delay, with denial. But every person we find makes them weaker. Every story we publish makes their world smaller." She paused, then added, "They built their power by hiding people like Eleanor. We're breaking it by naming them." By the weekend, the team had verified 5 additional residents inside Marigold Haven. Their names had come from cross-referenced records, fragments of old insurance claims, clinic referrals, and even one handwritten letter recovered from a nurse who had once worked on site before resigning abruptly. The registry prepared legal briefs, contacted the families, and scheduled emergency hearings. Colin coordinated digital support. Dana drove back to the ridge to monitor activity. And Martha prepared to testify in person again, this time not about memory, but about a present still unfolding. She stood before the court on a rainy Monday, the air thick with humidity and the courtroom too cold from overactive air conditioning. The judge was quiet but attentive. The opposing counsel tried to interrupt. But Martha didn't break pace. "They told her she didn't need to remember who she was," she said, voice calm but unyielding. "They told her family that access was a risk, that her silence meant peace. But peace is not the absence of noise, it's the presence of dignity. And Eleanor had none until we brought her home." The ruling came that afternoon. Full release, unconditional. The courtroom remained quiet, but outside in the waiting area, Eleanor held her sister's hand, tears finally spilling in silence neither of them tried to stop. Back at the registry, the ripple had already begun. News of Eleanor's rescue spread online. Advocacy groups shared her photo, not the one from the van, but a new image, taken outside the safe house, her eyes soft, her smile faint, a blanket wrapped loosely over her shoulders. The caption read, "She remembered her name, and so did we." Martha printed the image and pinned it to the wall near the center of the archive. Below it she wrote, "One down, many to go." Colin walked in, holding 2 folders. 3 more confirmations just came in, 2 still inside. 1, "We think past last spring. No record of release, but we'll verify." Martha took a breath. "We'll publish the list next week. Names, dates, photos. Let the world see them. Let no one say they vanished quietly." That night, she walked once more to the maple tree planted behind the registry building. The wind had picked up. Leaves spun across the ground in small spirals, rustling in soft protest. She touched the bark gently. "Lorna, we're still here." And then, she whispered something she had not dared say before, not even to herself. "We're winning." Not because the system had collapsed, but because, piece by piece, it was being unmasked. And that truth, once seen, could never be unseen again. It was nearly midnight when the call came. Martha was alone in the office, the others long gone, the building resting in that deep kind of quiet only winter nights know. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, light and steady. The streetlight cast a soft yellow glow across the windowsill. She was organizing files when the landline rang a sound that had become rare. Most people used email now, or secure messaging, but this call came through the old number, the one listed in the earliest version of the registry. The number no longer public, but somehow still remembered. She answered, her voice low. "Registry." For a moment there was only static. Then a voice. Weak, frayed. "You don't know me." Martha straightened. "That's all right, go ahead. I was at Bellamy's. Before they changed the name. Before the renovations. I wasn't on any list. They called me something else. They said I was a mistake." Quote. Martha's heart began to hammer. "Can you tell me your name now?" A pause. Then, "They never gave it back." The line went silent again, and then disconnected. She sat there, the receiver still pressed to her ear, listening to the hum of the dead line. Slowly she replaced it, her hand trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what she already knew. There were still more. Still unnamed, still unheard. And now, after everything, the hearings, the testimony, the photographs, the legislation, the rescues, it struck her with sudden searing clarity. There would never be a final count, because the system hadn't started with Bellamy's, and it wouldn't end with Marigold. The files might be organized, the names might be printed and read aloud, but there would always be some who vanished into the silence, just beyond the edge of record-keeping. People no one had been looking for. People forgotten not because they were hard to find, but because no one had ever really tried. Martha rose slowly and crossed to the window. Snow had begun to coat the branches of the maple tree outside, the one they planted for Lorna, the one where the word witness was carved into stone. She stared at it for a long time, then turned and returned to her desk. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the drawer. At the top, in ink darker than night, she wrote, "File number 000, name unknown, status calling." She left the rest blank. It was her way of saying, "We haven't stopped listening." The next morning, the press ran a story on a new investigation in northern Nevada, another facility under the same umbrella, same owners, same architecture, hidden beneath a new name, nestled beside a chapel, with rooms that locked from the outside. The headlines called it a breakthrough. But Martha knew better. It wasn't a breakthrough. It was just the next door opening. Weeks later, a letter arrived in the mail. Handwritten, no return address. Inside was a single sentence. What if they were never lost? Just buried deep enough to forget themselves. No signature. No further explanation. Just that one chilling line. She read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it beside the others. And in that moment, Martha realized the work would never be finished. Not in her lifetime. Not in any. But it would continue, because silence, once broken, does not return untouched. It echoes. It wakes others. And even in the dark, someone will hear it and answer back.